When I was a kid, I had really bad nightmares. Now, everyone has bad dreams, but not like this. I don't remember much from that time in my life, but I remember I couldn't sleep. And because I couldn't sleep, everything felt like a dream. And because my dreams were nightmares, well, everywhere I looked, I saw hell. I was 13 when my parents found Holloman and Graves. Or rather, the pair found us. They called themselves trauma specialists, and apparently they gave some vague story about having been contacted to offer help through one of the doctors or psychologists I'd seen. Their offer and service was strange but simple. They could take my nightmares away. In retrospect, it's odd that my parents agreed to such a thing. Then again, I was in really bad shape at the time, and I think my folks were desperate. And to be fair, I know better than most how compelling the short, fat little Mr. Holloman and the tall and gaunt Mrs. Graves can be. They'll make the oddest requests, and they themselves are more than a little weird, but in the moment it all seems as reasonable as can be. Either way, they cured me of my nightmares, and I was able to finally sleep and live again. That may sound melodramatic to some, but if you've ever been lost that far from the shores of slumber, you know that it isn't. Shores of slumber, that's something Mr. Holloman would sometimes say. Jesus, even now I guess they're still in my brain. Still, the point is the same. I felt like they saved my life, and I was grateful. I think that's a big part of why I was so quick to agree when they visited me again my last year of college. I was in another state by then, but then I'd never had a true sense of where they had come from in the first place. From the client's perspective, they would just appear, right when they or someone they loved was desperate and willing to agree to their help. Then after they were done, they were gone again, like strange but kind angels that didn't want to overstay their welcome or had others waiting in need. So anyway, they found me at my apartment and asked if I'd be interested in a job working for them. And because of my gratitude, and because I wanted inside of the special mystery they'd represented since I was a kid, I said yes immediately. It wasn't until they'd left with an agreement from me to come to an address the following day that I began to really wonder what kind of job they wanted me to do. And when I showed up at the address the next day, I found that instead of an office building or even a house, it was just an abandoned lot. Thinking I'd either gotten the wrong address or they were playing some odd kind of practical joke, I was about to leave when a dark car pulled up beside me, and Mrs. Graves rolled down her window and told me to get in. That we had a client waiting. And heart-pounding, I got in. I spent the next 4 years working for them. My job was always the same: carry the bags, set everything up, and get the paperwork signed and filed. Necessary stuff, I supposed, but nothing they couldn't do themselves. Their reasoning was that they were getting older and less able to carry stuff and deal with some of the paperwork that needed to be maintained. And maybe that was true to an extent. Neither of them looked old or frail, but they had clearly aged from the way I pictured them in my memory, standing over my bed, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was a relatively easy job that paid well and helped people. And as bizarre as much of it was, I got used to it much like you do anything. I would listen patiently while the two of them made the initial introductions and sales pitch. I say sales pitch because we did charge, though Mr. Holloman told me early on that the money and paperwork were largely just ornamental and meaningless. They would happily do the work for free. But people were far more willing to agree to it if they had to pay something, and there was some kind of agreement in place. So once they had them willing to sign, I took care of the contract being completed, and then went to set up a suitable bedroom for the client. This didn't amount to too much usually. Basically, I had to secure hand and leg restraints to the bed or mattress. Make sure that all doors and windows were not only securely shut and locked or otherwise blocked, but also well sealed with tape along every crack. Same thing for any air vent or other meaningful gap that might lead out of the room. When I was finished, I'd call the pair in to check my work, we'd bring in the client, and then I'd seal up that door as well. The client would lie down on the bed. I'd comfortably secure their wrists and ankles with padded cuffs, and then Mrs. Graves would come with her needle, while Mr. Holloman prepared to begin telling the story. Some people asked about the story afterward, but almost everyone wanted to know what was in the small glass syringe she was injecting into their neck. She would tell them it was a mixture of sedative, mild paralytic, low-dose DMT, and a couple of normal anxiety-reducing medications. That was the only time I ever saw them actually lie to the clients. Mr. Holloman would usually be standing in a corner of the room, hands tightly clasped in front of him. The soft creaking of the brown leather gloves he usually wore sounding loud in the quiet of the room as he squeezed and released his hands like the beating of some unknown heart. Mrs. Graves would stand by patiently, waiting until he uttered the first word before bending down to slide the needle into the client's neck. Sometimes a person would groan slightly as she gently covered their eyes and pushed in the amber liquid filling the syringe, but otherwise, everything was perfectly still and silent, perfectly removed from the world outside until Mr. Holloman began to speak. His words flowed like dark honey as the story spun out into the quiet of the room. Once upon a time there was a dream. Now you may think your dreams are your own, that you make them from your own memories, your own imagination. But you would be mistaken. The dreams come before the dreamers. We may put our own faces and hopes and fears on the dreams we encounter. But that is simply an evolutionary mechanism we have developed to try and hide from a simple truth. We do not make the dreams. The dreams make us, and they are not ours, we are theirs. And what we glimpse of them, it is merely the fingertips or the edge of a shark's fin, a half-glimpsed shadow pregnant with the inevitable reality that something much more grand and vast lives down in the unseen depths below. And we live and breathe and exist because, at least for a moment, they think it so. So once upon a time there was a dream, and that dream imagined many things, other dreams for one, other worlds for another, other worlds filled with new life that could see the dreams, if only a little, and in seeing the dreams, change the dreams and the dreamers alike and make them both more. And so it was for a long time. But not all dreams are kind, and change, once begun, is never-ending. Some dreams wanted more than being seen and breathing life into new worlds. They wanted to cross over, to push their way through the membranes of reality and be born anew in this world and others. And the thinnest places to invade are found in the darkest chambers of our minds. You have such a being pressing against the walls of your mind right now, scratching away at this reality's edge and slowly killing you with every bite of its nail. It means to come through, and its bloody birth will be the end of you. Unfortunately, we cannot stop the birth. By the time we know to look for you, the process is too far along. All we can do is choose when the birth happens. In a place of our choosing and early enough that you will likely survive, and it will be too weak to fight. The solution we have given you will facilitate this process within the next half hour. You may think this is all a fanciful tale, or that this too is a dream. Rest easy that what you believe does not matter. And before this hour is done, you will either be safe, or you will be dead. And either way, we will be with you until it is done. Sometimes people were trying to cry out or escape by the end of the story. Whether they believed him or not, it's an understandable reaction. A necessary reaction, Mr. Holloman explained to me soon after I went to work for them. Part of the process of stimulating the birth. Regardless, the solution did have some paralytic and sedative effects, and their noises and struggles were soft and fleeting. Usually there was some period of fresh silence as the client fell into a deep sleep, and then they would start twitching. It was a subtle thing at first. Their sweaty cheek would jump. Their eyes would roll under exhaustion-darkened lids. Then their hands would begin to curl like dying leaves. That's when you knew it was finally coming. Every time was different. Every nightmare is different. I've seen smoke pour out of people's mouths. I've seen hundreds of rats pour bloodlessly from their chest. I've seen a white snake slither out of a man's nethers, and a purple strand of what looked like mucus or web push out from behind a woman's eyes. So many things that should hurt or kill the client, but doesn't hurt them at all, because in some ways it's not real. Mrs. Graves called it the afterbirth of unreality becoming real. I don't fully understand what that means, but I know that every time it was terrifying. When the nightmare was born, the pair were always quick to act. They had a large sack made of dark, pebbled skin, and while Mr. Holloman held it open, Mrs. Graves would begin to whistle. A soft, not unpleasant sound on the ear, though it made my stomach twist slightly every time. For the nightmares, however, it was something more. Wherever they were going, whatever crack they were trying to escape through, the whistle seemed to stop them in their tracks. Mist or bird or any other form they took, they would start drifting toward the sound as in a daze, and when Mrs. Graves somehow sent her whistle into the bag, they usually walked right in without complaint. After the bag was closed, it was done. The client was allowed to sleep a few hours of peaceful rest, and when he or she woke up, they knew immediately that the thing that had been haunting them was gone now. We collected our payment and left, typically never hearing from the people again unless they referred someone to us. Most of those referrals went unanswered. Holloman and Graves did not cater to those with normal nightmares, after all. Hearing all of this, you likely think I'm lying, or just making up a story to entertain. Aside from sounding bizarre and fantastical, why would I stay in such a terrifying job for so long if it were true? I could say it was the money, which was decent, or helping people, which was very nice. But the truth was that I did it because every time they called me to work, I was being invited into something special. Magical. Something that was real in a way that most things I or you experience are not. There was a time that Holloman and Graves were like gods to me. I wanted their approval, wanted to be like them. They knew and could do so much, and so far as I could tell, they were still human, so what they were was still attainable. They were slow to tell me more than what I needed to do my work, but I could see a path forward to gaining their trust enough that the inner secrets of how and why they did what they did would be revealed to me. Maybe it was that worship, that idolization, that caused me to question things when I saw the first crack appear. And from that seed of doubt, I wound up digging a grave for a monster and crawling through the midnight caverns of a cave that should not exist. I wound up lost for a time in a house that wasn't a house, but no, I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to start with that first crack. The night that I learned that Mr. Holloman and Mrs. Graves were capable of making mistakes. We were helping a young woman that had tried to hurt herself the week before. Part of it was sleep deprivation, but she was also laboring under the delusion that something was trying to get inside her, control her or use her somehow. After a few days of observation at a hospital, she'd been sent home with parents that were all too willing to accept our help when we suddenly appeared at their door. Everything went fine at first. I'd sealed up the room like normal, and it was a fairly new house without any warped floors or cracked walls that posed special concerns. Mrs. Graves had given the solution and Mr. Holloman had started the story, but something was different this time. The girl wasn't looking upset or falling asleep. Instead, she was looking directly at Mr. Holloman, and she was laughing. By that point, I'd already been working for them for over a year, done dozens of these sessions. And yet despite all the obvious similarities to what you might see in a dime a dozen devil possession movie, I never had that thought until just then. Not because of the bedroom or the restraints or the ritual of it all, but because of the look on that woman's face. The inhuman malice and intelligence and will that was there, none of which was coming from her. There was an other, and unlike the rest, it was ready to be born. The room started flooding with black water. It probably started flowing from her, but it all happened so fast that I couldn't tell the source before it was cold and thick around my calves, and I was more focused on being terrified and looking for reassurance from Graves or Holloman. The look of fear I saw on their faces nearly made my heart stop. "Break the window. We have to get out." Mrs. Graves' voice was higher and louder than I'd ever heard before, and I started sloshing toward the window, leading out onto the side porch of the house immediately. Mr. Holloman grabbed my arm as I got close. "No, you fool. If we break the barrier, it can escape." I heard Graves splashing up behind me, and her voice was softer and harder now. And if we don't, it will drown us in here. And once we're gone, it's just tape and wood and glass. Holloman met her eyes over my shoulder, and then gave a grunting nod before letting go of my arm. Do it. Be careful. Pulling off my jacket, I wrapped it around my arm and broke out the nearest window's glass. I was turning to go get the girl off the bed when Mrs. Graves put a gentle hand on my shoulder. There's no helping her, I'm afraid. It's coming from her. Just go. Go. I didn't argue. Aside from trusting them, I was so scared that the passing idea of helping the client was all the bravery I could muster. I crawled clumsily through the window and then helped my two employers out as the water was reaching Holloman's lower chest. We stumbled out into the cold night air of the yard, and I had to fight the urge to strip off naked. I could still feel the residue of that liquid touching me, and it felt dirty and toxic in a way nothing else ever had. Shuddering, I settled on kicking off my shoes and socks and squeezing what I could from my pants as I looked back at the house. The water was pouring out of the window now, except with each moment it seemed to grow thicker, first water, then sludge, then a black mud that slid down the exterior wall of the house for a moment before just fading away into the shadows on the porch. I looked over at Holloman. He still looked frightened and angry, but he didn't look surprised. This isn't the first time this has happened to them. He caught me looking and gave a slight frown. Put your shoes back on. We need to be leaving. I stared at him openly now. What are you talking about? We have to go check on Julia. Mrs. Graves walked over, wringing out the ends of her black and silver hair. There's no point, I'm afraid. She's already dead. What? How do? Mr. Holloman cut in, and we have more to do. Things will get worse now. And as was so often the case, they were right. Get in. This was a week after we all almost died at Julia Rafferty's house. I hadn't spoken to them since they dropped me back off at my car, and I wasn't at all sure that I wanted to hear from them again. Still, when Mrs. Graves had called and told me where to meet them, I went. Partially because it was hard to tell them no, but also because I wanted answers. And when Mr. Holloman told me to get in the car, I didn't move. No, hold up. Before I go anywhere with you, we're going to have a conversation. About what happened. About what exactly is going on. Holloman sighed and rolled up the window before shutting off the ignition. The two of them discussed things inside the car for a few seconds, and then they got out together, looking at me in the detached way that I might notice a bug crawling over my shoe. Swallowing, I forced myself to not take a step back or look away. Instead, I focused on Mrs. Graves. What happened to Julia, I mean? Is she dead? The woman nodded somberly. She is. When they are strong enough to do it, when one of these creatures escapes, they always kill the host before they leave. I'm not sure, but I think it's because they believe they can be forced back via the host. She gave a small shrug. We've never tried that, but we do know that on the rare occasion that we express the nightmare too late, after it has grown too strong, the host invariably dies. And on one occasion we saw one have a chance to escape, and instead it went back to end the host. Her expression darkened. A mistake on that one's part, as it gave us the chance to capture it after all. I frowned. So you saved that person, that host? Mr. Holloman cut in. No, we used the distraction provided by it killing the host to bind it into the bag. Seeing my expression, he waved off my reproachful glance. Never mind being sanctimonious. This is hard and dangerous work, and the risks we take make the world a better place, or will in time. I'm not going to apologize for doing whatever it takes. Giving him an uncertain nod, a new thought occurred to me. So what about her family? Her parents were in the living room when we took her in there. Oh God, are they going to think we murdered her? Graves shook her head. Not at all. I texted one of our people to contact both them and emergency services as soon as we left that night. The poor girl was found unresponsive, and the death has been ruled natural due to heart failure. Uncommon in one so young, but she had numerous documented health issues thanks to her passenger. As for the family, they were naturally very upset at first, but they've come to understand there was nothing more we could have done. I stared at her. What do you mean? We leave a flooded room and a broken window and their dead daughter, and what? They're just cool with it. Holloman shot me a dark look. No one is cool with it, but we went and spoke with them later and came to an agreement. His face broke into a small, cold smile. We'll never hear from them again. Swallowing, I looked back to Graves. Okay, let's say I believe all that, and that I think we're helping people, because overall I do. My next question is, what are we actually doing? What are those things? I've asked before, but frankly I've never gotten a straight answer, and I think I deserve one. Graves raised an eyebrow. We deserve very little in this life, and you are far from being in a position to make demands. You either want to continue on with our work, or you wish to end your employment here. That choice is entirely yours. I did look down then, though less to avoid their gaze than to study my own interior. I was afraid, and I didn't know how much I could really trust what they were telling me. And that poor girl had died, as had apparently others in the past. On the other hand, they had been trying to help the girl, hadn't they? And had they ever done anything to hurt anyone, or been bad to me? No, not really. They'd always been strange and tight-lipped, but they treated me well enough. And if the work really was important... Mr. Holloman stepped forward with a grimace. Look, kid, you have a good heart and mind. We can see that, see your potential. And we're not trying to be unreasonable about any of this. He gave me a small smile. But this stuff, it is important and dangerous. And while we wouldn't be working with you if we didn't trust you, there are levels of trust. We can't just open the doors wide for everyone we run across. Not until we know you're going to work out long term. You understand, don't you? I nodded as I held his gaze. I guess I do. I don't like it, but I get it at least. His smile widened. Good. Then how about we get back to... How many? His expression darkened again as Mrs. Graves stepped forward and put a hand on his shoulder. How many what? How many helpers have you had before me? Holloman's face fell a little and his eyes grew sad. 3. Mouth dry, I forced myself to go on. And how many of them died doing this stuff with you? Mrs. Graves' voice trembled slightly as she spoke. All of them. Suppressing a shudder, I let out a long breath. Okay, well, that's terrifying. But at least I believe you. And for now, I guess that's enough. So let's go. We drove for 2 hours in relative quiet before arriving at the loft apartment of Wallace Minter. Wallace was a 52-year-old investment banker that had started having profound night terrors the year before. At first, he'd attributed it to normal stress. He'd gotten a divorce 8 months earlier, and his normally intense job had become even more tightly wound lately. But when he woke up one night curled up in the corner of his kitchen, knuckles bloody from where he'd been punching dents into his fridge, well, he knew he needed something more than a sleeping pill. The start had been doctors and therapists, but things kept getting worse instead of better, and by the time we showed up at his door, he'd been on medical leave from work for over 2 weeks. I knew this because Mr. Holloman and Mrs. Graves knew this. They normally only told me the name of the person we were visiting before we arrived, but this time it was different. As we parked, Mrs. Graves began telling me these details. I was interested, both in the information itself and this sudden expansion of what I was being told, but it also made me curious. I waited until she seemed finished with her summary of Wallace, and then I asked my question. Why are you telling me this? I mean, I'm very interested, and I appreciate you sharing more with me, but why now? Mr. Holloman glanced up in the rearview mirror at me in the back seat. Because maybe you're right, and it's time you knew a bit more. But more than that, it's because you've passed a milestone. 2, in fact. You faced the expression of one of these things when they were strong and ready, and you're still alive. Swallowing, I nodded. Okay. And what's the other milestone? His eyes crinkled slightly as he grinned. After everything you've seen, you still got back in the car. When he opened the door, Wallace Minter looked like we'd interrupted his crawl to a grave. He'd been a heavy-set man at one point, but now pallid, greasy flesh hung loose on his cheeks, and he had the ropey aroma of layers of old sweat and illness. I half expected him to sound hoarse or congested when he spoke, but his voice was surprisingly smooth and deep. "Yes, what do you want?" Mrs. Graves gave him a smile. "We're here to help you, Mr. Minter. We were referred by. No more doctors, bunch of goddamn charlatans. All you all want is money, and now you're showing up at my door?" Mr. Holloman leaned forward, his voice calm and soothing. "We are not doctors, and while we charge a nominal fee, that is not why we do this. We do this to help." Wallace furrowed his brow at him. "So not even doctors? What, fucking snake oil salesmen? Faith healers?" He started to shut the door. "Thanks, but no tha." He looked down as the door stopped, and seeing my foot there, he stared back up at me with weak outrage. "Get out of here before I call the fucking. You're going to die in there." He stopped, blinking. "What did you say?" I held his gaze as I went on. "I said you're going to die in there. If you don't get help for this thing inside of you, that's keeping you from sleeping, that's keeping you scared and angry all the time, it will wind up killing you." His face went slack as tears welled up in his eyes. "How do you know?" I gestured back at Holloman and Graves. "Because they know, and because I've worked with them long enough to know that they can save people like you. People that no one else can help." His face was swimming in emotions now, fear and anger, but also a kind of anxious, fragile hope. "You're saying they can help me." I took in a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Confident, but honest. Without letting on that, I halfway wanted him to tell us no, because I was shit scared of being in a sealed room with whatever he had inside him. "I'm saying that we will try our best, and that our best is probably the best shot you have left." Lips trembling, he nodded and stepped aside. "Okay, ik kom in." I looked over at my bosses when I'd been talking to him. It had never occurred to me that they'd want me to shut up or think I was overstepping my bounds. Now that it did, I searched their faces for anger or irritation. Instead, I saw fear. A look passed between them as I'd first turned. It was quick, and they covered it as soon as they saw I was watching them, but it had been there. Some silent communication, a shared emotion of, what? Worry, terror, something in between, maybe. I felt the air in my chest go thin at that look, but I forced myself to speak. "Is that okay with the two of you?" Mrs. Graves gave me a weak smile. "Certainly, lead the way." I felt a little relieved at that, but only a little. Something was definitely wrong, but I didn't understand what. Ducking my head a little, I edged past them to the stairwell. I'll go get the stuff up." 30 minutes later, the contract was signed and the room was sealed. I'd expected Wallace to question or argue against the stranger parts of our process, but apparently his resistance at the door had used the last of his strength. That got me to thinking, and I pulled Mrs. Graves aside before we took him into the room. "Are you sure we aren't, too late? I mean, he really does look like he's at the end of his rope. What if it's been in there too long? Gotten too strong? What if it's like last time?" Her eyes were troubled as she looked away. "It's a fair question, a good question that I'm proud of you for asking. And a good answer would be that I don't know for sure." Heart pounding, I pushed on. "Would that be the honest answer?" She glanced past me and let out a short sigh. "Partially, but a more fully honest answer would be that either way, I don't know that we have a choice." I stared at her. What does that mean?" Licking her lips, she gave a small shrug. "We have certain obligations, and our failure last week has set us back." Graves shook her head slightly. "This isn't the time or place for this. Let's get this done. No mistakes for any of us, understand?" I started to respond, but she was already moving past me toward where Holloman was coming out of the bedroom with a questioning look. She waved it away, telling him that we were ready to begin. He glanced at me, and despite the twisting in my stomach, I nodded. It was just nerves and excitement, I told myself. Everything was going to be fine this time. Looking back on it now, there's a part of me that wishes I could go back and stop that past self from gripping Wallace's shoulder and leading him into that bedroom. Tell that earlier me that nothing was worth what came after. and that it all could have been avoided if, instead of taking him into the bedroom, I just listened to my fears and walked away right then and there. I think the me of 20 minutes later, when Mrs. Graves had already given Wallace the injection and Mr. Holloman was trying to finish the story while that horrible buzzing noise grew to a fever pitch, that me would have listened, especially when the buzzing stopped and Wallace's head split open, vomiting out the black squirming thing with too many faces and eyes. I still remember the moment when it raised its head and looked at me. I felt my pants grow wet, but I wasn't embarrassed. All I knew in that moment was that I was about to die. I think that past me would have listened to just about anything I told him. Even if I let slip that no, you'll get out of that room without a scratch, he still would have done just about anything to not feel so scared for another single second. And if I told him that it wasn't too late, that he could still walk away from it, all of it. Not just Wallace, but Holloman and Graves, the nightmares, everything. Just walk away free and clean. I just did it now. I think maybe that earlier self would have believed me and tried to do just that. I can still see that thing crawling down Wallace's legs, chittering from a dozen mouths on its misshapen, piebald head, a cold intelligence dancing in its oil-drop eyes as it drew closer to my position at the foot of the bed. Holloman had opened the sack now, and Graves was trying to whistle, but it only had eyes for me. I'd tell that terrified me that it was okay, that I could still get away from not only this thing, but everything that would follow, that there was still time to stop what was coming, and it would be a lie, because as I would come to realize, it was already far, far too late. They put something in the water, you know. The man's voice, soft and yet still shrill in my ear, had woken me from a gentle, rocking slumber. Opening my eyes, I tried to get my bearings even as they started to water and my gorge began to rise. Oh God, what was that taste? Thick and smoky and bitter. I gagged a little as I took it in enough to realize I was on a city bus. How did I get here? And what was this man saying? I looked over at him and saw right away he was insane. A thrill of confused fear ran through me. He clearly expected a response, and I thought it best to play along. The water. He furrowed his brow in frustration as he dug a knuckle into his left nostril with a disdainful sniff. Yes, yes, the water. Put drugs in it to make us docile. He gestured at the bus passengers. Some were asleep as I'd been, while others were staring dully out the window or into their phones, eyes searching the glass for other wheres than here. I wanted to change seats, but didn't quite dare. You don't say. His nostrils went red as they flared. I do say, they don't want us thinking, realizing what this place is. They just want us to blindly breathe and fuck and give in. Eat the shit they feed us. I was so drawn in by his strange passion that I didn't realize the bus had come to a stop until the man jumped up into the center aisle. Glancing around uncertainly, I realized I was actually nervous about him leaving me alone. Leaning forward with a flush in my cheeks, I whispered to him, "Where are we?" The man let out a shriek of laughter. "Where are we?" Stomping to the front of the bus, he ran down the steps and out to the sidewalk before running around the bus and up to my window. "Where are we?" He glanced to his right, grin widening as he rolled his eyes back to me. "We're in hell." The truck didn't even slow down when it hit him. I heard the wet thudding scrape of him being dragged between the wheels for a few yards before he tumbled out in a wet pile on up the road. A few people murmured or exclaimed, but there were no real screams at first. It was only when they saw each other that the rest of the passengers all started squawking like startled birds. I had the thought that no one really cared. There was no real fear or sadness, just performance for the sake of being seen or heard, or some insane impulse like a tuning fork that has been struck and now must hum along until enough time has passed to draw stillness back to it again. I didn't scream. I hated the sound of it all, and besides, I was distracted by what I had noticed in the seat next to me. What my brief companion had left behind. It was a notepad filled with tight lines of cursive that were very legible despite their small stature. It started with, "Fourth set of notes for article." I say fourth, though I can't say for sure. These fuckers keep swiping them when they can. They want me to forget who I am and why I'm here. Make me think I'm like these poor people they've got trapped here. But I won't, I can't. People have to know that this place exists. I think they're pumping the stuff out in mists now. I smell medicine smells coming through the sewer grates. Fucking with my head. Got to keep it together. I'm Peter Maywing. I'm a freelance investigative journalist that has covered 2 wars, a dozen corporate cover-ups, and stood down the fucking government when they came asking for my people. My sources. Shit, I need to get out of here soon. Why hasn't anyone gotten us out of here yet? I think months have passed. Just found this notebook again. I'd put the date or time, but I don't know when it is. There aren't any clocks or calendars here, and if you ask anyone about them, they just laugh. The only reason I remembered who I was is because Clint remembered who he was and came and found me. We have to escape. Heart pounding, I glanced around to see if anyone was looking at me. They weren't. Most had sat back down, though a few were still yipping like coyotes settling down for the night. Shuddering, I stuffed the notebook under my jacket and got off the bus. Nothing looked familiar here. Not the places or the people, or even the air, which had an odd minty smell when the wind blew right. Pulling my scarf up to my face, I walked along for a few minutes before finding a small diner to duck into. I had no money in my pockets, but I did have a white card, and when I pulled it out questioningly, the waitress took it with a nod and brought it and a cup of coffee back to the table. Once I was sure no one was paying attention, I pulled out the notebook and kept reading. The buddy system. That was always our idea. Me and Clint would go in separately, but we'd watch each other's backs and make sure we both got out, or if shit went sideways, that at least one of us did. But they caught on to our plan, or they always knew. Now they just reset us periodically, like we're computers that are acting up. Not exactly wiping the hard drive, but it's harder to get back the important stuff every time I wake up somewhere not knowing who or where I am. I need to hide this somewhere safe. I think I've been reset at least twice since I last wrote in this thing. The real me, my life and memories, why I'm here. It's all like I'm remembering the memory of a dream. There are so many layers between me and the truth that everything is fuzzy. Clint has been reset almost as much as me, but he takes it better. He's always been more resilient, I think. I'm really scared, and I think if they wipe me again, I won't get myself back. So I need to write it down right now. Maybe for me, but probably for you, Clint. If I see I'm not going to make it, if I can see it coming early enough, I'll try to find you. On a bus or at your house, or somewhere. And I'll leave this for you before I go. Because I have to go, buddy. I can't take it in here anymore. I have to get out one way or another. I am Peter Maywing, you are Clint Thurman. We are both writers and journalists. You got a tip about a secret place where numerous forces around the world were shipping off their lunatics and their undesirables to live. Not a prison or an institution, but an entire city. A sealed world away from everything where the hidden remain so. They drug our food and water. Keep us confused and docile while doing a cruel mimicry of a real human life. It works well most of the time, but there are always episodes. People break down and start screaming or crying, or hurting each other, or stripping off naked, or going on killing sprees, but everyone is so numb that no one really pays attention to what's wrong around them for very long. These journals have been my intermittent lifeline, but I feel my grip slipping. You need to get out with or without me. Get out and tell what this place is. It's hell. I think I'll start drinking my piss. I know that sounds crazy, but I think if I drink my own fluid I'll be more me. Because I don't know who me is anymore. Piss and shit, shit and piss. I only like one and the other I'd miss. I just read what I write it. I can't wait any longer. I have to find you, give you a chance before I go by. Stay me long enough to warn you. I see you. They're loading you and 4 other people onto the bus. I got you. The buddy system, remember? Pissing shitters, taking our air. That was the last entry. I reread it all 3 more times, and every time I remembered a bit more. He was right, wasn't he? We were journalists. This was an investigation. We were going to help people and get this all shut down. But first I had to escape. I was terrified, but maybe because of the drugs they gave us, it was all in a very detached way. Swishing around the last of my coffee to get rid of the foulness on my tongue, I stuffed the notebook into my jacket and headed out onto the street. The card was some kind of debit card, I guessed. I was able to take taxis all over the city that afternoon. I didn't know who was a patient and who was a guard, so I had to give vague directions, but my real intention was to see the edges of the city. How far did it go, and what was the security like there? If it was made by humans, it was flawed, and I could find some mistake to exploit if I was smart and patient. Or so I thought, but everywhere I went there were just roads that ended in walls, not of stone or concrete, but of glass. Black, featureless glass that went up as high as I could see. How was that even possible? How could you build something like that and have it not blow over or collapse under its own weight? My stomach was churning as I hailed my fourth taxi. Evening was creeping in now and the light would be gone soon, but I still had south left. Maybe that's where everything came and went. It took me a few minutes to realize that instead of taking me that way, the driver was headed to the heart of the city. I think you turned around. I said I wanted to go to the southern edge of the city. The man behind the glass chuckled. Oh, I heard you, but the radio man said take you to the station, so to the station you go. Heart pounding, I leaned forward. What? Who's the radio man? Another chuckle. The man on the radio, of course. I slammed a fist into the thick pane between us. God damn it, what's the station then? His eyes were yellowed and cruel when he found mine in the mirror. It's where they correct you. They pulled me from the taxi easily, using just enough force to get me to comply, no more or less. I'd been driven to an underground garage beneath a huge monolithic building I couldn't recall in my spotty memory. Had it always been there, or had it raised up like a dragon's head when it caught my scent? What the fuck was wrong with me? I needed to stay sane and find a way out of this. They drugged me through several floors and twisting corridors, before strapping me down to a chair in a black chamber lined with tapestries of some kind. Looking closer, I started to retch. They weren't tapestries, they were the skins of people, whole skins, flayed from their bodies, stretched and dried before being hung on display. Trembling, I felt my bowels loosen slightly as a woman walked in from the far end of the room and made her way to me. Hello, Tony. I swallowed. My name isn't Tony. It's Clint. I'm Clinton Thurman. I know who I am. Pulling up a chair from outside of my vision, she clucked her tongue as she studied me with a concerned look on her face. Oh, Tony, not this again. She shook her head and let out a small sigh. I don't blame you. I don't. I honestly want to blame Peter, but he wasn't well either, was he? And my mother always said you don't speak ill of the dead. Leaning forward, she put a cool hand on my forehead. But he is the one that always inflamed your delusions, wasn't he? What was it this time? You were spies. On a TV show. What? I blinked, feeling tears in the corners of my eyes. We're reporters. She lifted her eyebrows. Ah, that one. So you're reporters. What are you reporting on? The weather? Frowning at her, I shook my head. I'm not telling you anything. The woman smiled at me. That's fine, Tony. I don't need you to. I'll tell you. According to Peter, you're both investigative journalists, right? Here to expose the city as some cruel prison where the dark forces of the world hide their unmentionables. Is that about right? I felt a tear sliding down my cheek as I stared at her. I am not crazy. Her smile fell away, replaced by a look of sadness. Honey, yes you are. I know some people don't like using that word, but of course you are. You have delusions and hallucinations. We've been in this very room so many times, and you've said it looked like a spaceship the inside of a tree, and those are just the pleasant ones. Your insanity lends itself to very macabre and paranoid flights of fancy. It felt hard to breathe now, and it took a couple of tries before I got my next question out. So this place isn't a city of crazy people? She patted my knee. It is, but not in a bad way. This is a very exclusive. Very expensive institution for those that have families that can afford to have their loved ones treated and kept in an environment that is minimally restrictive, while giving them the treatment they need. They can live full lives without feeling isolated or stigmatized. And in some cases, they can even be reintegrated into society down the line if they make enough progress. She clucked her tongue again. Progress that you seem to be making before Peter got his hooks into you again. Shame on him. The woman waggled her fingers in the air. I mean it, I know he's dead, but shame on him. My head was swimming, but I tried to focus on one thing she'd said. I can get out? Pursing her lips, she gave a small nod. Maybe, someday I hope so, but I won't lie to you. This latest episode has set you back considerably. We need to do a reset again, which I really hate because we just did one. A reset? Standing up, she pushed the chair back as she nodded again. Yes, I don't like doing them in quick succession, but I feel like getting this all out of the way now is better than letting it fester. Give you a clean start on the right track. How does that sound? I was sobbing now, terrified and grateful and ashamed. I sucked in a deep breath, the mint burning my lungs as it went down. Yes, yes, anything you say. Her smile was back now. Very good. Clapping her hands, she stepped further to the side as the two men who had brought me there carried in a thick plastic tarp and unrolled it on the floor before my chair. Once it was attached to hooks and firmly in place, she told them to bring him in. They left quickly, heading behind me, and several minutes passed in silence as we waited. I wanted to ask a million questions, but I was so confused now, and I worried that if I made problems, I would only make things worse for myself. So I stayed quiet until some door opened behind us, and I gave a startled coyote yelp. I could smell it before I saw it. A ponderous pale mound of flesh 3 times the size of a normal man. Rolls of fat dry and white and flaking on top, and oozing clear and crimson lines from whatever raw rot lay underneath those folds. It had a head, but I only glimpsed its shape briefly as it was wheeled around and positioned, so its stirruped legs were over the clear plastic top. Fighting back the urge to vomit, I looked over at the woman questioningly and whispered, "What is it?" She hit a button on the wall, and all my straps unlocked and pulled away. I would have stood up then, but her angry gaze had me pinned to the spot. "He is our god, and you will kneel to him. Now." Shaking uncontrollably, I pitched myself forward onto the tarp. How could any of this be real? It had to be more delusions. Was I really this far G? Dark matter began to curl out of the shadowy, fetid place between his legs, plopping wetly to the tarp, with an explosion of new corrupted scents that made my eyes burn. A second piece, and then a third, a fourth, and then no more. All the time I was frozen on my knees, too afraid and disgusted to move or speak. I heard the woman step closer now as she put a cold hand on my neck. This is the reset process, one of the many gifts he gives us. This will put you back on the right path. Get rid of these delusions once and for all. Oh God, what do I have to do? She snorted lightly. Isn't it obvious? When I didn't respond, she pushed my head forward gently. Eat it, all of it. Eat it all right up. Can I get some water, please? My mouth tastes bad. The lady smiled at me. You can when you get finished writing it all down. Everything you remember. I held up the laptop like a child who had finished an unsavory meal. I did already. Her smile fell away. Don't be pert. You didn't write this part, did you? Keep going. Oh, sorry, okay. I paused, and then, why are you having me write all this? You told me it didn't really happen. No, I said that it didn't matter that it happened. That no one will believe it, especially if we tell it to them like it's real. People are mistrustful of the truth when they want a lie. I nodded as though I understood, though I didn't at all. So what will you do with what I'm writing? She shrugged. Leak it onto the internet, maybe. I might post it on a forum. No sleep, maybe. What's that? She licked her thumb and rubbed something thick and gummy off my cheek before popping it back in her mouth. Sucking on it, she closed her eyes with a contented sigh. I think that's enough, Clint. You said my name was Tony. Did I? Well, I told you there was a world outside of here too, didn't I? I felt fear welling up in me again. You did. She giggled, her eyes hard as little chips of glass. I can't believe you believed me. She licked her thumb and rubbed something thick and gummy off my cheek before popping it back in her mouth. Sucking on it, she closed her eyes with a contented sigh. I think that's enough, Clint. You said my name was Tony. Did I? Well, I told you there was a world outside of here too, didn't I? I felt fear welling up in me again. You did. She giggled, her eyes hard as little chips of glass. I can't believe you believed me. The world fell away just then, not into darkness, but into a swirl of too bright lights and colors as my eyes and brain tried to adjust to what I was seeing. Where was I? A bedroom. There was a painfully thin woman hovering above me, her face drawn down in a look of worry and fear. I felt like I knew her, but I couldn't remember for sure. Clinton, are you back with us? I heard a man's voice off to the side, gruff but not unkind, and threaded through with the same anxiety I'd sensed in hers. Of course he is. We can't see through him anymore, can we? Give him room to breathe and come to. The woman shot him a look. He could have died. Or worse, and I don't know what effects the elixir might have on someone that's not infested. We need to get him checked by a doctor. Grunting disapproval, the man stepped closer and peered down at me. Kid, do you know where you are? Who you are? I blinked. I did, didn't I? I hadn't at first, but seeing them both together, I thought I might know now. You're Mr. Holloman, and she's Mrs. Graves. I looked between them uncertainly. That is right, isn't it? He was grinning and nodding as Mrs. Graves leaned forward to touch my head. Something about it made me recoil in fear, and seeing that, she withdrew her hand back to her lap. Yes, that's right. She paused a moment and then continued. And do you know who you are? I felt a moment of panic that the answer wasn't on my tongue immediately. This was stupid. Of course I had to know who I was. Fumbling in the shrouded dark of my mind, I finally found what I was looking for. I'm Clint Thurman, aren't I? Holloman chuckled. See, he's going to be fine. No doctors needed. I think I'm an investigative reporter? His face fell. Fuck. Well, he's bound to be a bit scrambled after. Just give him some air. Graves shot him another dark look before turning back to me. You aren't a reporter, no. You work for us. You help us help people and stop bad things from... Well, you help us stop bad things. I frowned at her. That sounded right, but it was more of a feeling than a memory. What's wrong with me that I can't remember? Holloman crouched down again. You got your bell rung, kid. Attacked by one of these bad things. But we got you sorted out in time. My heart was pounding now. Attacked. Is the thing that attacked me still here? Mrs. Graves' expression darkened. No, it escaped. After it attacked you, we weren't sure where it went at first. We were focused on trying to get you back. And in those few seconds it found some break or flaw in the seal and crawled out through the crack. So no need to worry. It's gone. I heard myself responding with words I didn't entirely understand. I sealed the room, though. I double-checked everything. She reached out hesitantly and patted my arm. It's all right. It was very powerful. We're still not sure how it was able to break through. Holloman had started pacing a few feet away, but he paused and looked at me again with a frown. Yeah, mistakes are going to happen, kid. We all fuck up from time to time. Nothing to worry about. Just glad you're okay. Seems like you're remembering more too. I nodded as I began to sit up weakly. I think I am, yeah. My head is splitting and I kind of feel like everything I know is loose. Like it's a bunch of melting icebergs. I looked past him to the bed. Is the client? Did it get him? Holloman glanced toward the bed and back to me. No, he's fine, sleeping like a baby. I jumped a little as I was struck by the memory of seeing the man's head split open as the nightmare crawled free. But I saw him die, his head burst open. I remember that now. Graves nodded gently, we all do. But it's like... Well, you may not remember this yet, but I've told you before about how these things... Well, they warp reality when they come into this world. I call it afterbirth, but you might think of it as a black hole. Everything bends around their point of entry, and not everything you see or hear is real. Or if it is real, it's only real for a short time before normal reality snaps back into place. I was interested in what she was saying, but I was also distracted by how terrified I felt. Not just scared, but chilled to the bone like I'd been dipped in a frozen lake. Can we leave now? I want to leave now. Holloman squatted down and slapped my leg. Sure. Let's get you out to the car, and then I'll wake this poor bastard up and get everything squared. I'm awake. Holloman's eyes widened slightly as he turned and laughed. So you are. He grabbed me under the armpit while Mrs. Graves gripped my other arm. Together they lifted enough for me to stand shakily on my own, and when I was upright, I looked over at the man strapped down to the bed. He seemed fine at first, but the longer he looked at me, he started crying. My employers were looking confused and concerned, but I already knew what was wrong. Feet unsure, I stepped to the end of the bed. Your name is Wallace, isn't it? He nodded, eyes raw and nose wet. Yeah, it is. But you remember going by Peter, don't you? He nodded again, lips trembling. I do, yeah. And you remember being in the city? With me? For a long time? The man let out a small wail as he laid back on his pillow and closed his eyes tight. Oh God, I do. I remember it all too much. Shuddering, I turned and started walking for the door before I remembered. It was still taped up. I looked at Holloman. Please unseal this for me or I'll rip the fucking door off the wall. His face flushed a little, but he went over and stripped away the tape quickly before handing me the car keys and opening the door. We'll be out in a few minutes, kid. Just go rest, okay? I nodded absently as I started out of the room. Graves followed me out, and when I stopped and looked at her, she drew closer, speaking in a lower voice. Normally, the hosts don't remember much of anything. Do you know what he's talking about? Why he's so upset? Letting out a long breath, I took her hand and pressed the car keys back into them. Yeah, I have an idea. He remembers being trapped in the same place I was. He remembers killing himself. Just like I remember watching it. Graves stared at me speechless, but I didn't give her much time to respond. I turned and walked out of the apartment, the building, and on out into the night. I felt exhausted and every step was hard, but I wasn't going to get back in that fucking car with them. I didn't want to be around any of it anymore. And walking back home in the dark, hitching rides with strangers until I could get to a bus stop was preferable at the moment. I was awake for the next 36 hours, and when I finally made it back home, I slept for another day and a half. I'm glad I didn't wake often during that time, because the few times I did, I was always terrified. I'd jump out of bed, check my apartment, look outside, turn on the TV, verifying as best I could that I was in the real world and not the city. And then, trembling and weeping, I would return to bed and tumble back asleep. I didn't dream in that sleep, but it wasn't entirely untroubled either. I could sense that something was different, like the air pressure had suddenly shifted, but inside me instead of out in the world. And when I finally did wake up for good, the feeling was still there. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but I didn't believe it. My dad used to say that there are things that you think and things that you know, and the key to being wise is being able to tell the difference. And I knew something was wrong with me. Over the next month, I almost called them a dozen times. Usually when the feeling of being watched or weighed down by something was at its worst, but a couple of days just because I missed them and the work. As stupid as that might sound. I had enough money saved up that I didn't have to find another job right away, and as angry and scared and sad as I'd been when I'd left them, I don't think I'd quite given up on ever going back either. Still, my hands would start trembling when I picked up my phone to call, and when I answered Graves' call, I could barely breathe. Hello. Hello, Clinton. How are you doing? Okay, I guess. How are you and Mr. Holloman? Well enough, missing you quite a bit. The work you do, of course, but you as a person too. We may be bad at showing it, but we've grown quite fond of you. I swallowed and looked up at the ceiling. I could feel her trying to put hooks into me again, but I wasn't sure if I minded or not. Well, that's nice. I miss you guys too. I just, I don't know if I can do it anymore. There was a pause and then, I understand. And I don't blame you for having worries about everything that's happened. But before we talk about any of that, how have you been doing really? Any issues? Sleeping okay? My heart started to beat faster. She knew something. Sleeping okay, yeah. But something seems off. I feel like something's over my shoulder all the time. Well, there may be. The phone creaked slightly as I gripped it harder. There may be. What are you talking about? Do I have something after me? Clinton, I really don't know. I doubt it's the thing that attacked you. I've been doing this for quite a while, and the handful of times something has escaped, we've never had it come back and try to hunt us. There was the word hunt. I felt a chill go up my spine. Have you ever had one of them attack you? Another pause. Attack, yes. I remember twice that I've seen Gordon get attacked, and once myself when I was much younger. Gordon. I'd never heard her call him by his first name before. I wasn't sure what it meant, but it didn't matter at the moment. I was scared and angry and desperate for answers. Did either of you get attacked like I did? Pulled somewhere else? She was silent for several moments this time, and when she answered, her voice had a brittle sound to it. No, not like that. I've never seen anything like that. Sucking in a breath, I nodded to myself. Fuck. Okay, what happened to me then? What did it do to me? It jumped on you. It was so fast. And for a moment I could see it there, wrapped around your neck, breathing into your face. I wasn't sure if it was stealing your breath or giving you some of its own. And then it just faded away, but not just it. You started to flicker. Flicker. I'm sure it sounds strange, but I don't know how else to describe it. You never disappeared, but you weren't fully there either. And as we watched, I could see you slipping out of our world like a dying heartbeat. There and then not, there and then not. I was afraid we would lose you for good. So I pulled out the spare vial of elixir and gave you a partial dose. I didn't know if it would work, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. And it worked. I'd sat down on my sofa halfway through her words, and now I found the phone growing heavy in my hand. It was trying to take me all the way there, wasn't it? I don't know, Clint, but I think so, yes. To keep me. Probably yes. And you injected me with your... What is the elixir, by the way? How do you make it? We don't. I snorted softly. All right then. Where does it come from? You know I can't tell you that yet. But if you continue working with us, in time. Oh, in time, that's right. Always holding out a bone to keep the dumb dog in line. Is that it? Well, I'm sick and fucking tired of just going along. Be quiet. What? Listen, I'm just about. No, you need to shut up and listen. Before this all gets much, much worse. It wasn't the harshness of her tone that made me fall silent. It was what was underneath that hard, cold surface. Genuine concern, perhaps, and beyond that, something that sounded close to terror. When I didn't keep going, Mrs. Graves began to speak again. This isn't about what's fair or what you want. It's about what's real, what's happening and will happen. There's no rule book for this stuff. I learned from Gordon, and now we're trying to teach you. But we didn't trick you into this, or pick you for this life. You were marked before we ever met you, same as I am. Same as Gordon. I let out a long breath. You had a nightmare too? Like I had, like Wallace? Oh yes, my family thought I was possessed by the devil. Had locked me in the barn when Gordon came and helped me. The same way we helped you when you were a little boy. The same way you're helping people now. Wallace didn't look like he'd been helped when I left. But he's alive, isn't he? And he's doing much better now that he's had time to heal. And that's what we've been giving you too. Time to get over everything that happened. Build back up for the work ahead. I let out a shaky laugh. Mrs. Graves, I think I believe you, but I still don't know if I can do this anymore. I'm too afraid. Clint, do you ever think about the tape? The tape. Right. The tape that you used to seal off the room. Seal off the room against these terrible things that are nesting in these people. Why do you think that something as simple as tape works against them escaping most of the time? I mean, it's something you guys do to it, right? Some kind of treatment or spell or something. I don't know. You won't ever tell me half of what you do. I suppose that's fair, but no, it's just tape. We buy it in bulk online, and it's a good quality duct tape, but it's nothing special. Not sprinkled with holy water or etched with magical runes. Just tape. Tape that shouldn't give these things the slightest problem at all. I frowned to myself alone in my living room. Okay, so why does it work? Because we have something protecting us. Working through us, it imbues some of our actions with a special weight, so we can capture these nightmares. What, like a guardian angel or something? She gave a soft laugh. You could look at it like that, sure. But it has limitations. We're not invulnerable. The night that Julia died, we would have probably died too if we hadn't gotten out of the room in time. But it does give us some edge. Some cushion. Something that you won't have if you don't continue the work. I felt my mouth go dry. So you're saying that if I don't continue working with you guys, I'm going to be alone? No, Clint, I'm saying that if you don't stay with us, you won't be alone for long. And that's the problem. 2 days later, I was climbing back into the car, going with them to another job. Not a house or an apartment this time, but a town named Braxton. When I asked Holloman why we were going there was none of his usual jokes or sarcasm. I'd seen him just a few weeks earlier, but he seemed to have aged years since that night with Wallace. I was wondering if he heard my question when he suddenly spoke in a low, quiet voice. Because the town is wrong somehow. At first, everyone was laughing. Then they started killing each other. Then they fell asleep. Okay, but what are we supposed to do about it? He raised his bloodshot eyes to mine in the rearview mirror, and I felt dread pooling in my chest like poison. We have to wake them up. We drove into Braxton from the north on the main highway. I'd wanted to ask more questions after the things Holloman had said, but I decided to wait and see instead. Whatever this place was, whatever all of this was, I couldn't just keep blindly following whatever my employers told me. This was no longer just about my job. It was about my life. So instead of asking questions and swallowing whatever answer I got, I kept quiet and paid attention as we traveled into the city limits of Braxton. There was a large building coming up on the left, and squinting, I could just make out the sign running along the roofline 5 stories up. It was a hospital. Oh my God. That was Mrs. Graves, her voice soft and trembling with enough fear that it derailed my train of thought and caused me to follow her gaze to a large, dark mound out on the grounds of the hospital. Mr. Holloman was slowing down now as he sucked air between his teeth and muttered "goddamn it" under his breath. I only noticed his reaction distantly, however, as I squinted out the window and tried to understand what we were all looking at. When I did, my stomach twisted into a cramp as my gorge began to rise. It was bodies. A large heap of bodies that had obviously been partially burned at one point and then left rotting for weeks or months. There were still patches of clothes and hair and desiccated flesh. But mostly it was a mound of bones melded into a bleak little hill by time and decay. A few more people were scattered about, some obviously dead, but others almost like. Are some of those people sleeping? Are there people out there that's still alive and fucking sleeping? Mrs. Graves met my eyes before putting her hand on Holloman's arm. We don't need to stop here. This isn't a good place to start. He shot her a dark look, his tone harsh. I'm not an idiot, I know. Stopping himself, he let out a long sigh. I'm sorry, Gracie. I'm afraid, and that makes me short-tempered, but I shouldn't take it out on you. She patted his arm. I know, it's okay. But let's go on to town and see what we can see. She turned back to look at me. You okay with that too? Heart pounding, I forced myself to stop glancing out the window and sit back in my seat. Yeah, it's got to be better than here. We drove on toward the town proper, Holloman taking a slow and cautious route that cut up and down the occasional side street before moving back to the main road on a trajectory toward what street signs said was downtown Braxton. None of us talked as we went, but I could feel our collective fear and anxiety growing every mile we drove deeper into that place. There were people laying in cars, sprawled out near or sometimes in the streets, slumped against buildings, and curled up in yards as we passed. I couldn't say for sure with all of them, only some would occasionally twitch, and so were obviously alive, but most of them didn't really look dead. Just asleep. The surreal strangeness of it all was made 100 times worse by some of the other things scattered around amid the slumbering citizenry of Braxton. Wrecked cars, burned out buildings, bodies that definitely were dead because they'd been torn apart and were rotting. Amid all of this were numerous dark splashes and stains that looked like the faded remnants of old horrors. The slaughter that happened here before the survivors decided to curl up and take a long winter's nap. It was all terrifying, but even worse, it was impossible. How? How could any of this be happening? Didn't you say this started months ago? Graves nodded as she glanced back to the rear seat. Or longer, yes. I frowned at her. So how does that make sense? The bodies and stuff, maybe they're decaying like they would over that much time in the elements. Because how would I know, right? I'm no expert, though to me even that stuff seems like it's fresher than it would be after that long outside. But let's set that aside. I leaned forward and pointed to the closest sidewalk, where a pair of cops were laying against each other outside of a downtown store called You So and So. How are these people still alive? How haven't they starved to death? Frozen to death, been eaten by bugs or wolves or whatever the fuck. It makes no sense. Letting out a sigh, Holloman pulled into an empty parking space and turned off the car. Clint. And why wouldn't people know about this place? Why wouldn't it be in the national news if everyone just started killing each other here and then fell asleep? He turned to face me, his voice hard but not cruel. Clint, stop. Listen, please. Sucking in a breath, I nodded. Okay, yeah, listening. Holloman glanced at Graves and then back to me. Good. First off, we don't have all the answers. We know this is where we're supposed to go and have some idea of what we'd find here and what we need to do. But we don't have answers for everything. He paused for a moment before going on, his words softer and more measured. That being said, this phenomena is being caused by something in or near this town. An infection, for lack of a better term. Seeing my eyes widen, he raised his hand. Not that kind of infection. I don't know that it's contagious anymore, and even if it was, well, the three of us should be inoculated against its effects. Inoculated? What are you talking about? I haven't had a shot for this shit. Graves gave me a small smile. Not a shot, your service, your work with us. It grants you a measure of protection too. It keeps you able to do the work that's needed. I had 100 questions, but I had to be smart and selective if I was going to get anything useful out of them. Okay, so we'll just let that go for now. What about the other? Why don't people know about this, and how are these people all still alive? Holloman pursed his lips. When this first happened, I think it really was like an infection, spreading throughout the town and anyone who it came across. But once it had enough people, the infection changed. The people it had driven crazy, they started to sleep and to dream, and the reality around this place began to thicken and harden like a pearl. In the world, but not of it, forgotten except by those that stumbled upon it by accident. Then, why wouldn't one of those people? I trailed off as I looked at my phone. No signal. I could hear fresh fear in my voice when I spoke again. This place is a trap, isn't it? Graves was looking out the window when she spoke. It certainly looks that way. I don't know that it's meant to be specifically, but I think it's removed from normal reality in such a way that the effect is largely the same. I felt my tongue growing thick in my mouth. So you can get in but not back out. Like a fucking roach motel? I asked the next question, afraid I already knew the answer. Can we leave? Holloman gave a slight shake of his head. As things stand at the moment, no, but there is a way to stop what's happening here. to reconcile this place back into our world. Then we'll be able to leave again. My jaw was clenching as I stared at him. Why didn't you fucking tell me we couldn't leave before we wandered in here? Graves did turn and look at me then. We honestly didn't know for sure, and we think we have to have you with us for this. For this all to work properly. I grimaced at her. What do we have to do to unfuck this place and get to leave? It's our understanding that there is a mine underneath this town. She pointed her long, thin finger down and bored through the air like a drill headed for the heart of the earth. A very old and deep hole that for some reason the people of this town started mining again a while back. They dug up and woke up something even older than the hole down there. Licking her lips, she gave a nervous laugh. And now we have to find it and kill it. My chest was on fire as we cut down another side street. Holloman was lagging behind, croaking out breathless directions as he tried to read the map while staying ahead of the growing mob behind us. We were going to die here. None of us really knew where we were going, and Mrs. Graves's arm was bleeding steadily from where that kid had stuck her a few minutes earlier. It might be enough to kill her in time, but that wouldn't be a problem. The people of Braxton would tear us apart long before then. Keep her head still. They're starting to twitch more, and it has to get in at the inner canthus precisely to have a full effect. Nodding, I leaned forward, my knees digging into the dreaming woman's shoulders as I tightened my inner thigh's grip on the sides of her head. We had done this more than 50 times in the last 3 hours, and I was getting very tired, but Graves was right. They were starting to fight back a bit more. We'd started with the 2 cops outside of You So and So. Graves got me to lay them both out flat on their backs and straddle their heads while putting weight on their shoulders, in case they have a sudden reaction to the elixir. I wanted to ask what kind of reaction that might be, but I held my tongue for the moment. Holding the larger man's head steady, I'd opened his left eye as instructed while Graves dripped a single drop of elixir into it. The effect had been subtle but immediate. The twitching tension that had been in the man's body had melted away, replaced instead by soft, heavy snoring. When I met Graves' eyes, she nodded with a small smile. He's truly sleeping now. I frowned in return. He wasn't before. Graves shook her head. Not a natural sleep, no. He was in a state of induced dreaming. The elixir has freed him from that. I'd kept quiet then, but by the time we reached this latest woman, who went from violently spasming to sleeping peacefully with a single drop from Graves, I couldn't help myself. What is it? The elixir, I mean. Clint. No, you guys say you want me here. Need me? Okay, I'm here. Fucking trapped here, apparently. So do me a solid and stop jerking me around. She sighed and glanced around. Holloman had gone off to find a map of the town or some other source of information. Before he left, I'd asked why he didn't just search the internet before we came here. He gave me a hollow laugh and shrugged. Said he'd tried, but the world has forgotten this place exists, and not just in people's memories. That reminder of how isolated we were here had been troubling, but Graves' expression was somehow worse. There was a degree of mistrust and fear in Graves' face as she checked that her partner was not around. Were they not as united and in control as they wanted me to believe? And if not, what did that mean for our odds of escaping this place? Satisfied we were alone, she turned back to me. The elixir is a substance that comes from the one we serve. Like they make it for you. For us? Her expression grew haunted. In a sense, yes. Not in a laboratory or factory, though. It is Essen. I found a map of the town finally. We both jumped slightly as Holloman approached. Turning to him, I saw his expression was growing hard. What are you two talking about? I shook my head as I stood up from the sleeping woman, legs slightly trembling. Nothing. Does the map show us where we need to go? Holloman grimaced slightly. Potentially, yes. It's one of these poorly drawn tourist maps. The detail is there, but the scale? I don't know, but it does show a historic mine in the western edge of the city. I'd guess that'll be where we find what we're looking for. He gestured down at the sleeping woman. Though we've got to work faster if we're going to get to that point any time soon. He looked at Graves. How many have you done so far? She licked her lips. 53 with this woman. Frowning, he shook his head slightly. Not nearly enough yet. I stepped forward. So how many is enough? And enough for what? He shifted his gaze back to me. Enough to weaken the grip of the thing living here. To give us a chance of not dying when we confront it. Swallowing, I dropped my eyes. Okay. So does that mean we have to do everyone still alive in the town? He shook his head. No, just a percentage need to be dosed. According to this map, back in 2014, the town's population was about 9,000 people. From what we've seen and been told, I'd guess that less than 2,000 of those are probably still alive. If we dose 10% of that number, we should be safe by 200 or so. I groaned. Fuck, that'll take all night. Holloman shrugged and gave a hard smile. Do you have other plans? He snorted. Besides, I found a gymnasium 3 blocks over. It looks like some of the townspeople were hiding there before they got infected and fell asleep. Graves had been putting her bottle of elixir back in its satchel, but she paused and looked up now. How many are in there? Holloman didn't meet her eyes, but instead looked back down the way he'd came. Alive. Hard to say for sure. There are a few dead in there too. But if I had to guess, it's close to 100. She glanced at me and nodded. Okay then, let's go. The outside of the gymnasium proudly proclaimed itself to be home of the Braxton Barbarians. A name that was ironically apt given everything that had happened there. Bodies and signs of long past fighting littered the parking lot as we made our way toward the building. We found a couple of sleepers amid the chaos, but most were truly dead here. The carnage got much worse as we reached the double doors leading into the gym. A couple of dozen bodies lay in a jumbled pile of slow rot at the entry point. I could see several holes that were probably gunshots on a number of the people, and the outside of the doors was streaked with bloody finger trails and dents, along with one long breach of the metal from a fire axe that was still lodged in the right door. Gagging a little, I had to fight the urge to just close my eyes and block it all out. Jesus, it was like a war here. They were trying to get in to the others, weren't they? Holloman puffed out a breath and nodded. Yes, it looks that way. For whatever reason, some people weren't affected as quickly as others. Maybe they tried to leave town and couldn't, or maybe by the time they realized how bad things were, all they could do was try to hide in here. Stepping over a dead teenaged girl, he yanked open the door with a squeal. They chained the door from the inside, but they left a gap to shoot through. I found some bolt cutters at a hardware store back the way we came and took care of the chain, but we still probably want to block this door open when we go in. He gave me a weary glance. Don't want to be trapped in there if things go sour. Graves touched Holloman's shoulder. Do you think it's dangerous in there? He shrugged but didn't turn to look at her. Dangerous? Yes. They all seem asleep though. And this whole place is dangerous. The quicker we can get done, the less risk we have of running into something unexpected and nasty. Pulling out a small flashlight, he stepped inside and we followed. The first room was a large atrium with 2 sets of double doors on the far side leading into the gym proper. Spare chairs and tables had been piled against another exterior door down at the far end, and clustered around that pile were 2 men and a woman, all alive and twitching from down in the belly of some deep dream. Graves gestured to them. We may as well get these before we venture inside. Holloman frowned but nodded. Yes, I suppose so. But let's hurry. 5 minutes later, the 3 were all truly asleep, and we were stepping into the gymnasium. The murk of the faint fading daylight coming in through the few grimy windows gave an illusion of normalcy at first. There were a few signs of what were probably discarded makeshift weapons, but no bodies or slumbering people at first. It wasn't until our lights reached the far corner of the gym that we saw the enormous mound of flesh that lay dreaming. Oh my God! Graves' voice trembled slightly as she took a few steps forward to get a better look. They're sleeping amid the dead, aren't they? Did they choose to do that? To sleep in that? Holloman nodded. I think so. The putrefaction is oddly slow in this place, and these people were likely all insane when they fell asleep, so I suppose it made some sense to them. My own voice was barely above a whisper when I spoke. Who are the dead people? In here, why did some die and some live? Graves spoke up. My guess is that not everyone got infected or turned at the same rate. The ones that were too slow or somehow immune to it got killed by the rest before being turned into bedding. Tears sprang to my eyes as the sudden urge to vomit overtook me. Doubling over, I vomited onto the dirty edge of what had once been a basketball court. Holloman patted my back. I did the same thing earlier. It's for the best. It'll make what we have to do easier. Throat burning, I gave him a sidelong glance. What's that? We need to pull all the dreamers free of that so we can give them the elixir. An hour later, we had dislodged 40-so people from the Hill of Death and dreaming that occupied darkest part of the gym. I'd vomited twice more, once when we pulled the first man free, and again when we hit a pocket of firm dead flesh holding a pair of women tightly. It should have been long withered away, but instead it was spongy and resistant to our attempts to yank the women out. It took all three of us pulling at the first woman and kicking at the rotten mess around her to break her free, and when she came out it was with a soft, liquid pop that filled the air with a foul smell that took my breath away. We pulled her away quickly and then grabbed the second, but we were only a few feet away from the mound when I had to stop and retch again. Wiping my mouth, I helped them slide her the rest of the way to where we had lined up the others on the far side of the gym. Why don't we do this batch and then get more? I spit again, more to get the smell off my tongue than the bile from retching. I need a break from going into that. Graves looked at the pile, and then at the twitching bodies we had laid out across the gym floor. I think we're less than halfway done with what's in there, but this is a good starting point. We can move them into the front room when we're done to make room for the rest. She looked at Holloman. Sound good to you? He nodded. Yes. Let's just hurry. It'll be dark soon. We were halfway done with the first batch when it happened. At the time, I was too terrified to consider the why of it all, and looking back on it later, I just chalked it up to our being tired, and in the routine of doing the same strange and horrible task over and over. And I guess that was my first mistake. It wasn't exactly the same thing over and over, because with every person we took from dreaming, the others grew more restless. I think we all realized this was building towards something bad, but our wordless agreement was just to work faster. Get it over with, so we could somehow finish whatever was happening in this town and get out. I think about that attitude now, and ironically enough, I marvel at it. I had no real idea of what we were facing or how we were supposed to beat it. But through some amalgam of desperate faith in Holloman and Graves and desperation at our situation, I trusted that it would work out so long as we had a plan and kept to it. That's probably why, when Graves cried out and shoved me off the man I was steadying for the elixir, there was no fear, just irritated surprise. It all happened so fast. She shoved me. I turned toward her even as I saw a blur of movement from behind. Someone small with a piece of metal or a knife, stabbing the air where I had been and hitting Mrs. Graves' arm instead. She let out a scream and reached for the attacker's wrist even as I was catching myself and trying to regain my balance so I could help. The air was suddenly split by the crack of a gunshot, and the small boy holding a butcher knife went tumbling back a couple of feet before sliding a few more. My eyes followed him first. I could already see blood pooling from his chest, and even at a distance, it was easy to tell he was dead in the moment before I turned to look for the source of the gunfire. It was Mr. Holloman, his eyes wide and roving as he looked around the gym and then at Mrs. Graves, his shocked expression narrowing to one of angry concern. "Gracie, are you okay?" She was cradling her arm and looked pale, but she managed to nod between deep, panicked breaths. Yes, I think so." She gave him a smile before looking over at me. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, thanks to." "Ha. Hee hee. Ha ha ha." It wasn't the laughter of one person or just a few. In fact, at first it seemed less like laughter than it did trickles of dirty water, crawling through new cracks in a dam, growing more eager and numerous with every second. I looked toward the dark corner of the room and saw what was crawling towards us wasn't foul streams, but madness given legs and hands and teeth. Dozens of dreamers, now woken back into whatever plague held this place, crawling and standing with the rotting muck of their family and friends clinging to their bodies as they picked up left-behind weapons and started to stand and walk towards us. Every lip curled into a smile between chuckles and cackles and guffaws. Ha ha. Hey, hey, hey. I turned to look at Holloman as he was stepping forward to lift Mrs. Graves to her feet and pull her toward the exit. He gave me a silent glance that told me all I needed to know. This was not according to plan. This was not in control. And if we didn't get away from this place and these people, we were all going to die. We'd made it back through the maze of downtown to the side opposite from the gym, but it didn't matter. Not only were the ones from the gym still after us, along with a few more dreamers they'd picked up along the way, but up ahead was another group of 15 or so men and women were running towards us with impromptu tools and manic grins that both flashed murder with each bouncing step closer. They were practically skipping towards us as they guffawed and giggled, and it might have been funny if not for the dead ice in their eyes. Jesus, we in here. I'd spotted the garage door of an old-fashioned service station across the street. It was propped open a foot by a cinder block, and while it might have been a trap set to lure us in, I didn't really think the people of Braxton had had the time or the sense to arrange it so quickly. These people, they didn't move or look right, and not just because they were crazy and trying to kill us. They all looked off somehow. Maybe it was the way they moved, or the loose way the skin hung on their cheeks, even when pulled back with their fishhook smiles. They were becoming something different, though whether it was less or more, I couldn't say. All of those thoughts were in the back of my mind as we rushed over to the door, and I tried to pull it up further for Mrs. Graves and Mr. Holloman to crawl under. The door only budged a few more inches before it let out a protesting rusty squeal and would go no further. Graves had already rolled through the gap, leaving a smear of blood in her wake, and Holloman was grunting as he sucked in his stomach and pulled himself past the door. Gasping with exhaustion and terror, I looked over my shoulder to see how far away the crowds were. The one cutting us off was still some distance away, though they were moving fast, but the ones behind us since the gym were 30 yards at most. I dropped to my belly and rolled through the gap, kicking the cinder block free as I went. It all happened in a few hurried seconds, but as I was getting to my knees, I already realized the problem. The block had been so easy to kick away because the door hadn't dropped back down when I let go to scoot under it. It was stuck, and as I stood up and started pulling on the other side, it immediately became clear that neither me nor Holloman's frenzied yanks and kicks were doing much good. "Back here! There are tires! Wedge them under." Mrs. Graves's voice was soft but strident, cutting through my panic as I followed her words to the back wall of the garage. There were several stacks of old tires back there, including several truck tires big enough to block the door gap if put end to end. Holloman ran with me to the back, yanking tires down and sliding them across the concrete floor to jam them into the space between the ground and the edge of the door. They were on the other side, clawing and pounding and laughing their heads off as they told us to let them in. But either they didn't catch on that we were plugging the hole they could crawl through, or they just didn't care. A couple of minutes later, we had 5 tires jammed across the opening. With the last bit of space partially blocked by a heavy-duty hand truck, we stuffed into the corner and ran through with chain to the last tire so it wouldn't be easily removed. Yet for all that, I knew it would only take a few minutes for the mob to dismantle our defenses, and that's assuming they couldn't force the door up themselves. I looked over and saw the same worries on the faces of Holloman and Graves. She looked past me and nodded towards the far corner. "There's a door back there. You better go close it in case they come in that way." Turning fast, I saw what she meant, an open door that seemed to lead to the store part of the gas station. Hard in my throat, I went to the door and peered through it. The store itself still seemed empty and intact, but I could see more and more people gathering outside. I jerked backward, afraid they might see me through the glass despite the darkness inside the store, but peeking back out a few moments later, there was no sign that they had. Still, they'd seen us go in here, right? Why weren't they coming in after us? Stepping back through the door and closing it behind me, I quietly slid over a mechanic's creeper and propped it under the knob before turning back to my employers. Holloman had managed to tourniquet Mrs. Graves' upper arm with her belt and bandage her forearm with a strip from his shirt, and while the strip of cloth was already turning red with blood, it was definitely an improvement from how she'd looked a few minutes earlier. Other, of course, from the fact that she looked as terrified as I felt. I walked back over to them, keeping my voice low. Why aren't they coming in? There's more around on the store side, but they weren't even really looking in through the windows. It's like they forgot we're in here. Holloman grimaced and gave a nod. That's probably exactly what has happened. We need to be very careful to not make noise or let them see us. I frowned at him. But how does that work? Are they like so crazy or brain damaged that they don't remember chasing us in here just now? Graves shook her head. No, I don't think so. Based on what we've seen and what we know, they may be insane, but they retain a large degree of sophistication. I think this is just, well, a measure of protection we're being provided by our service even here. I felt a flare of anger at her carefully chosen words. Oh, so more magic from our service. And what exactly do we serve again? Because I seem to always miss out on that part. Holloman started turning red. Clint now is not. I raised my hand and cut him off. Fuck it, just save your bullshit. You're actually right. We're about to die, and I'd rather focus on that not happening. Any ideas? I glanced between the two of them. Either of you. I looked past between them, and then Holloman glanced toward the shadowy back corner of the garage. I don't think there's another way out of here, but even if there was, they'd just be after us again as soon as we ran. But if they're that discombobulated, Clint, how many do you think are out there right now? I shook my head. Shit, I don't know. There were probably 30 or 40 following us, right? And another 12 or 15 trying to cut us off. I glanced back toward the store side of the gas station, but when I was closing the door, I could see out the windows pretty good, and yeah, there are still more coming. Holloman fluttered his hand in frustration. Yes, I understand, but how many? By your best guess. Scowling, I gave a shrug. I don't know. Probably 100 or more, if none of them are leaving again. He gave me a grim smile. Good. That may be enough. Enough for what? Wiping his forehead, he gestured up at the fluorescent light, sullenly illuminating the dingy garage we were in. Have you wondered about the electricity? Not every place has power, it seems, but some do. And where is that coming from? Is there an active power plant within the bubble of this place, filled with giggling electricians and engineers that are keeping the lights on? Or are there power lines running outside the bubble to where time and nature move differently? Some kind of lifeline to the world outside this. He waved around at the garage, his face contorted with disgust. This insane hell, he waggled a finger. No, neither. The thing that has taken this place and its people is keeping the lights on. Keeping the people asleep until now, feeding on their dreams and using a bit of that power to maintain certain things for whatever reasons. Perhaps to more easily lure in the occasional traveler, though that's just a guess. And it doesn't matter. What does matter is that it takes resources, and the more dreamers we take from it, the weaker it will become. I rolled my eyes. Well, no shit. But I don't think these fuckers are going to let us get near them with the eyedropper. And they don't look too sleepy either. Holloman started to give an angry reply when Mrs. Graves put a hand on his arm and my own. When they were in that dream state, the elixir was the only way to end that connection. If we had simply gone around and killed them, their deaths would have provided a powerful boost to this thing. Perhaps more than just letting it feed on them until they could no longer be sustained. It would have been akin to a ritual sacrifice. I felt my stomach twist as I saw where this was heading. And now, she let out a long, tired sigh. Now it has had to wake up part of them, sacrificing the power of their dreams to create a standing army to eliminate a threat, us. Unless and until they sleep again, that power is lost. Holloman cut in. And if you're right, and there are 100 or more out there, and given those we've already dosed, we could move past the breaking point in one fell swoop. I stared at her. You're talking about killing them, aren't you? Murdering 100 people. Graves shook her head. No, not murder. Self-defense. They will kill us eventually, and in horrible ways. This place, we're trapped here. Hard as it may be to hear, it's going to be either them or us. Holloman snorted. Enough of this. We can moralize after we're no longer in danger. He pointed to the abandoned sedan sitting in the far corner of the garage. Clint, go look for gas and oil. If you can't find much, see if you can siphon some from that car. I'd guess we'll need at least 20 gallons to spray them all down. I backed up a step. What are you talking about? You're going to walk out there and what? Spray them down with oil and gas, and set them on fire. He chuckled. No, that'd be suicide. Don't be an idiot. He pointed to a skylight above the sedan. I'm going to have you pry that open, and we'll go onto the roof and spray it down on them. If we're careful and they don't see us, they may just let us do it until it's too late. But first, you need to find something liquid that will burn. I looked back at Graves. And you're okay with this? She looked on the edge of tears. I'm not okay with any of this, but we don't have a choice. We have a job to do, and they will kill us otherwise. Please, Clint. Holloman looked ready to argue further, but I cut him off. Save it. I'm doing this because you're both right, but that doesn't mean I like it. He nodded. I appreciate that. I feel the same way. Will you please go find us some flammables while I stay with Gracie? Sure. The garage was big enough to hold 2 cars at a time, but with only the one slot occupied, I didn't think there'd be much to really search. Most of the walls were lined with tools, and there were miscellaneous pieces of equipment along the perimeter. But it wasn't till I started around the car that I saw something of interest. It was a pair of feet. I let out a gasp and started to back away, but something stopped me. This wasn't right. The feet were laying at a weird angle and looked lifeless. Taking a couple of steps forward, I could see more of the man's body. He had clearly been dead a while, though it was to tell how long in this place, and it wasn't hard to see how he'd died. A box cutter still lay clasped in his withered hand, stained from the gash he'd put in his own neck at the end. I thought about the cinder block at the door and wondered if he was the one that had put that there. Maybe hoping someone else would come along and rescue him for a time before he gave up hope. Tears springing to my eyes, I looked over at his other hand. It was a plastic grocery bag, and inside were the dried ruins of what had probably once been half an ice cream cake, along with plastic plates, candles, and other party supplies. Jesus, this looks like he was going to his kid's birthday party. I stumbled back a step before my eyes caught on a large metal drum in the corner. Black painted letters were stenciled along the side, with the first line saying 50 gallons. Below that was a longer line. Waste oil. Stepping cautionally by the poor dead man, I gingerly rocked it. It felt most of the way full. Sighing, I looked back down at the birthday bag. When I came back around, Graves and Holloman were looking at me with expectant desperation. I nodded. I found a drum back here. I think it has like 30 or 40 gallons of old oil in there. I threw a small plastic bag at Holloman's chest. Flinching, he fumblingly grabbed it and looked at it before giving me a sullen stare. Party balloons? His face split into a grin as he began to laugh softly. Oh, I see, yes, that should work well. Yes. Yeah, let's hurry and get this done. Come help me get the barrel out. Easing up from his spot next to Mrs. Graves, he bustled over past me, still chuckling. Sure thing, Chief. Time for a fire tonight. Frowning at him, I turned to look back at Graves, her eyes wide and more fearful than when we'd barely escaped the mob outside. She was mouthing something to me, lips trembling as she tried to enunciate each word clearly across the shadowy space. We're losing him. The oil was thick and sludgy, and Mrs. Graves had the idea of siphoning any old gas in the car out and mixing a little bit in with every balloon. That worked well enough. We'd found a manual oil extractor, so we could add a bit of air and gas before squirting in a thick glob of oil on top and tying it off. It was smelly, sweaty, tiring work, and the whole time I was terrified that the mob outside would suddenly remember their job and tear the garage down around us. But it never happened. Graves was sitting against the front of the car with her feet propped against one of the big tires we'd wedged into the front door's gap. And even though she looked like a light wind would blow her over, I could see she was vigilant for any sign our situation had changed, either outside or in. I'd been thinking about what she'd mouthed to me as we'd gone back to get the oil drum a few minutes earlier. We're losing him. She meant Holloman, of course, and losing him to the madness of this place seemed the logical assumption. I didn't think she was wrong. He had quieted down since we'd started working on the balloons, but his behavior had been out of character earlier, and there was a tension to his movements that made me think of a man who was fighting hard against a violent outburst. Or maybe just a bellow of laughter. "Mr. Holloman, can I ask you a question?" He froze halfway through squirting a column of oil into his latest balloon. "Can't it wait, Clint? I'm not as nimble as I used to be. My fingers are stiff and slippery. I need to focus." I paused for a moment and then decided to press on. "Sure, yeah, it sucks, just real quick. When we were in the gym and that kid attacked us, you sure got your gun out fast." Holloman stopped again, a small chuckle escaping as he rolled his eyes up to mine. "Well, you're welcome." I nodded, holding his gaze. Yeah, I'm glad you did. But I've just been thinking about that. You were facing us. Like before he attacked, you were facing us. And like you just said, you're not as spry as you used to be. I said nimble. Okay, nimble as you used to be. But you still got that gun out really fast. Looking back down at the balloon, he finished injecting the oil and tied it off before gently adding it to the pile on the floor. "And your point is?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe no point at all. If you were facing us and saw him coming soon enough to pull your gun and shoot that fast, why didn't you call out when he was coming at us? It was dark in there, but not that dark, and you should have been able to see him coming a few seconds before." I was tired and not paying attention, okay? He snapped, his harsh tone cutting through, even just barely above a whisper. "That's all it was." Holloman glanced back up to me. "Or do you think it was something else?" I lowered my gaze to the next balloon as I took the oil extractor from him. "No, I just wondered. I know it'll happen fast." He giggled softly before clearing his throat and grabbing a new balloon. "Yes, everything's moving so quickly." Glancing at the pile of balloons we'd already prepared, he tossed the last one down. "That's 15 already. Should be enough, I think." Standing up stiffly, I finished tying off the last balloon. Just gasoline and air in that one, but it might come in handy. Turning away, I stuffed it into my jacket pocket before looking up at the open skylight. I'd worried that would be the hardest part of our whole plan, but it actually wasn't even latched or locked. And standing on top of the car, I could reach the lip of the roof well enough to pull myself up. Knowing neither of them were going to be able to make it up top, I asked Holloman to tie off his jacket to make a sling I could carry the balloons in when I went. Meanwhile, Graves had found a pack of toilet paper and a lighter, suggesting I throw the burning rolls down onto the crowd once they were good and wet. Going back to get the items from her, she met my eyes with a questioning look. Not wanting to risk saying anything, I just gave her a slight shake of the head as I tried to send her my conflicting thoughts. Holloman was definitely off, and I still wondered if he didn't just stay quiet when he saw the boy coming at me in the gym. Why he'd do that I wasn't sure, but he suddenly got moving when he saw Graves was the one getting attacked. Still, what if it was just stress and fatigue? Not just for him, but for all of us. I wasn't in a laughing mood, but by that point I'd gone through so many cycles of fear and adrenaline that my brain felt fried. The only benefit of my stupor was it made it easier to set all my guilt aside about what I was about to try to do. This wasn't murder, it was self-defense. This wasn't slaughter, it was survival. If, of course, it even worked at all. I thought the smell of the people burning would be the worst part. It was terrible, a mix of the sweet, smoky smell of cooking flesh with a thick stink of burning oil, cooking its way through the crowd below. But it was far enough away that I only got a strong whiff when the wind turned in my direction from time to time, and I had tried to mentally prepare myself as I climbed up onto the roof. I needed to be clear and calm, not hesitate or panic. Get it all done right and before they had time to figure out what was going on. Not let the stench or sight of them burning overwhelm me before the job was finished. But in the end, it had all been very easy. They were all still clustered together, a few of them milling back and forth, but largely still and silent aside from the occasional chuckle or titter. A bunch of discarded toys that some awful thing had forgotten about until they were needed again. Or maybe it was still trying to use them, and its signal was just being jammed from whatever it was that was supposedly protecting us. I thought about Holloman again. Why wasn't he as protected? If it was that easy to be infected by this laughter, this joy plague, why wasn't it affecting me or Mrs. Graves? What was different about him? Reaching back down through the skylight, I grabbed the sling Holloman had made from his jacket and lifted it up. Stepping back to the roof's edge, I crouched down, fearful that the crowd would see me and attack again if I wasn't quick or stealthy enough. Mouth dry, I took out the first balloon. It was heavy and uneven in my hand, sloshing this way and that as though something inside was alive. But that was just a trick, wasn't it? The only things in there were fire and death. Pushing the thought aside, I threw the first balloon over the roof's edge into the crowd below. I was afraid it would just bounce off and roll harmlessly away, but no. It burst, flinging gas and oil across 5 or 6 people near the point of impact. After that, I threw the rest down very quickly. Only 2 actually did bounce. The rest all soaked the crowd, who for their part barely seemed to notice other than laughing a bit as they looked down at their wet and soiled clothes. I had a couple of times where people looked up in my direction, but just for a moment, and when I peeked out again, they'd already lost interest or forgotten what had happened. Even when I started throwing burning rolls of toilet paper into their midst, there were murmurs of surprise, but at first there was little else as people began to burn. It wasn't until the entire mob was ablaze that I started to hear it. Above the roar of the flames and the sizzling pop of people's bodies cooking, I could hear this strange harmony that I first took for music. Though it was harsh and penetrating, like a jagged shard of glass being shoved into my brain. But the more I stared down at the crowd, some of them already collapsing as their muscles and tendons gave way, the more I realized that everyone I could see was looking up at me now. Looking up and not singing, but laughing, and not from 100 voices, but all one voice steaming up from 100 mouths. It was the voice of the thing that lived here. Laughing this terrible laugh that was heavy with pain and sadness and fear, but also a kind of jolly madness. I couldn't hear any words from it, but that didn't stop my mind from forming a sentence, a sentiment, or maybe a challenge out of the clawing sound that was slowly dying down as the last of the people began to collapse or burn past moving or sounds or life. It may have been my imagination, but the words in my mind were still crystal clear. All right then, motherfucker. Come and get me. Shuddering, I made a circuit around the roof to make sure I hadn't left off any stragglers. But no, they'd all been together at the end, at least the ones near the gas station. Hands slick and numb, I eased myself back down to the garage and told Holloman and Graves that, at least for the moment, we had a means of escaping. Holloman raised an eyebrow. Escape. True escape is still blocked, I'm afraid. But how do you feel? Do you think we eliminated enough people to find this entity and kill it? I frowned at him. How the fuck would I know? You're supposed to. Clint. I stopped and looked over at Mrs. Graves questioningly as she continued. I know it sounds strange, but what Gordon is trying to ask is, how do you feel? Do you feel like it's time? I wanted to say no. That the thing I'd heard laughing through all those poor people as they'd burned was the devil, and you don't go looking for the devil, especially when you're in hell. But that's not what my gut was telling me. Instead, I felt like I was in the orbit of some dark, unseen planet, the gravity of it pulling at the core of me, whispering that, yes, now was the time to strike, while this other was weak and afraid. Yes, afraid of me and what came with me. I flinched and blinked at the flood of thoughts flowing through me. What the fuck was? I heard myself speaking before I'd even fully thought the words. Yes, it's time. It's time for us to go to the mine and expel it. We headed west to the historic old mine marked on Holloman's Braxton Sites map. On the drawing there was a small mining car filled with children zooming toward the black mouth of the mine. And I think they were meant to look like they were laughing. But looking at their wide eyes and gaping, frantic mouths, I couldn't help but think they were screaming. Or that maybe laughing is just screaming that we choose to ignore. It took over an hour walking there in the dark, and I was worried the entire way that we would get ambushed by another mob any minute. That fear was also why we decided against going back for the car. On foot we could keep to the shadows and possibly avoid trouble before it saw us, where in a car we'd draw more attention. In the end, it didn't matter. We didn't see many more people, and the few we did were all still twitchily dreaming. The road to the mine was loose, rough gravel, making each step a bit treacherous in the meager light from the moon and our phones when we dared to use them. Maybe our focus on not falling is why the man was able to get so close to us before we realized he was there. Evening, folks. I jumped and spun toward him while Mrs. Graves stumbled back and Mr. Holloman uttered a short, startled cry. The man's features were obscured in shadow, but his body wasn't. Even in the pale monochrome of the available light, I could make out the uniform and the name tag on one side of his chest that said Marcus. On the other side was a silver star, engraved with scrollwork around another single word. Sheriff. Seems awful late for y'all to be out and about in our fair little town. The man let out a hoarse giggle. Thinking about a trip to the mine, I'd wager. Graves found her voice first. Please let us pass. We're trying to help this town. Sheriff Marcus threw back his head with a deep, bellowing laugh that ended abruptly into a rattling cough. Hell, lady, we're way past saving, and I know what you've been up to in town. Your kind of saving ain't much saving at all. Holloman stepped up in front of Graves, his hand shaking as it gripped his gun. You get back, you won't stop us, and I think you know what we do to those that get in our way. Marcus looked at Holloman for a moment, his nose wrinkling as though he smelled something bad. Seeing his face, I had the thought that it had probably once been friendly, even handsome. Now it looked haggard and worn, a hard-baked mask cooked in the heat of this place's madness. And when he turned dismissively from Holloman to me, I could still feel that heat from his eyes even though they were lost again in shadow. No need for hostilities. He knows when he's whipped. Sent me to come fetch you. He turned and raked his eyes across my two employers. Not you two, only him. Graves was already shaking her head. No, absolutely. The sheriff cut her off with a snicker. There are still over 1,500 souls in this place. I can feel better than 300 within a mile of here. He shot a mocking look at Holloman. Did you bring that many bullets with you from Kerioth? The man turned back to Graves. Or do you mean to fight them all before bleeding away the last of your life? Stomach clenching, I walked toward him. No, I'll go. I looked back at Graves. Just me, it'll be okay. Give me the elixir. Graves seemed about to argue further, but finally she shook her head and pulled out the satchel. Handing it to me, she held on for a second, meeting my eyes. Please be careful, Clint. I nodded, giving a laugh I didn't feel. I'll try. It was strange. I was afraid then, and even more afraid when we went into the mine, but looking back now, I can see how small and remote that fear was in the face of the overwhelming sense that I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. That somehow, as insane as it seemed, I was meant to follow this madman down into the dark of the mine. "Okay, Sheriff, lead on." The man in front of me had been staring dully as he waited, but now he sprang to life, doing a small, shuffling jig in the gravel before turning and heading off toward the entrance to the mine. He didn't look back, as though he was as sure as I was that there was nowhere else I intended to go. I expected the entrance to just be a black hole in the earth, but to my surprise, there was a string of lights running from the mouth all the way down the throat, so far as I could see. I followed him silently into the first shaft for what felt like better than a mile through several turns and intersections, and then down a second shaft before we got to an ancient elevator that looked over a century old. As though reading my mind, Sheriff Marcus chuckled as he pulled back the safety chain and beckoned me inside. "It's not as old as it looks. Went in around 53, I think. This place has had several lives and deaths before this last one. I guess he was just sleeping down there through all of it, waiting for us to get deep enough to reach him." He chortled. "For him to reach us." I didn't ask who or what he meant. I already knew, or at least in that moment I felt like I knew enough. I wasn't sure what was going to happen when I met this creature, or how I was going to stop it, but every step I took felt like the right one, and in that moment, that was all I needed. The elevator ride down was surprisingly smooth, though it was noisy enough. I had the thought that we weren't dropping through a void at all, but crushing the ground beneath us as we went like a never-ending jackhammer or miner's pick. Then the ride was over, and these lower tunnels weren't lit like the higher ones had been. The sheriff pulled out a flashlight. We were restringing all this as we could. Hard to stay focused, you know, what with all the other activities we've been up to. But we were making headway until we fell asleep. But never you mind, old Harry will lead you true. Pushing out the light in front of him, he headed off again, and I followed him through a number of other tunnels and chambers before we finally came to a stop. The man glanced back at me. "He's up here around the corner. He will be polite, I think, so you do the same. Listen, Pert, you understand." My heart was hammering so loud I could barely hear him, but I nodded anyway. Walking forward and around the corner, I gasped as the air suddenly changed, thickening and cooling as though I'd stepped further into a large chamber lit, not by electric lights, but torches lining both walls. Even at a distance, I could see bones sticking out of those torches, both holding the flame and feeding it as the color lazily danced between red and blue and green. It was beautiful in a way, and cast a shifting palette of darkness and light across the thing that lay in the center of the room. It was enormous, probably 20 feet tall if it was standing, and over twice that in length. Even its head, broad and blunt and spiky with tufts of fur, was gigantic. It raised up to look at me with yellow eyes before giving a long yawn. Opened wide, its mouth was terrifying, filled with twin rows of thick, jagged teeth on either side of a long tongue of speckled pink and black. When it closed its mouth, it regarded me calmly enough, those eyes dancing with equal parts intelligence and madness. Behind its head, I saw a ridge of fur raise and give a rustling shake, like the warning of a snake before the bite. But this was no serpent. It was a hyena. Something in my mind caught and corrected itself. No, it was the hyena. The thing's black lips curled back suddenly as a terrible bubbling noise came from its throat and filled the space around us. It wasn't the same as what I'd expected. It was 100 times wilder and more varied, but it did remind me of hyena noises I had heard before. And whatever those noises might have meant to the animals, I knew what it meant to this thing. It was laughing. The burbling laughter began to subside, like a deep geyser that was spent, if only for a short while. The hyena stared at me silently for several seconds, its burning eyes fluttering and flickering before suddenly shifting from a pale yellow to a verdant green. Behind me, the sheriff stifled an uncomfortable chuckle even as the voice of the creature before me filled my brain. "Do you know what I am?" The voice was not overly loud in my head, but the strength of it pushing into my mind still caused me to wince and shudder as I tried to formulate a response. My first instinct was to say no, but I realized that wasn't true, and to lie in this place might be deadly. So, eyes watering, I forced myself to look back at the creature and give the answer I somehow had to give, even if it was not my own. You are the hyena. A small bubbling laugh as its eyes passed to yellow and back to green. Yes, I suppose that is an apt name, but names are not what we are. They are what others use to define us. Confine us, control us. It paused a moment and then added, Who controls you, Clint? I felt a fresh stab of fear at it using my name, but I pushed past it, trying to respond to everything out of instinct rather than overthinking it or giving what I hoped might be a pleasing answer. I don't really know. I guess it would be the thing that I work, that I serve. But I don't really know what that thing is. It could be like you, for all I know. It could, couldn't it? And if that was so, knowing more about me would help you to understand it, correct? Help you to know what holds your leash. I tried to not look irritated as I nodded. Maybe, yeah. I like you, Clint. I haven't decided if I'm going to kill you yet or not, but I do like you so far. Very reasonable and polite, so I will tell you a small story. If you survive this, it might even be of use to you down the line. Swallowing, I croaked out a soft thank you, but if the hyena heard it, it gave no sign. Instead, it began telling me where dreams come from. You are familiar with your world, and it may not surprise you to learn that there is a nearly infinite variety of this existence, each with its own variations on what has and will happen here. What you may not know is that these realities sit between other planes of existence known as the Seven Realms. And among those seven realms is the one I come from, Incarnata. Incarnata is one of the largest and most powerful realms, as it is home to so much of what you might call ideas and beliefs. It is ever-changing, always growing, and in some ways it has stronger ties to this reality than any other realm, as things here shape Incarnata. In fact, some would say that Incarnata exists because the hearts and minds of this infinite terrestrial plane think it and wish it into being, or at least give it form and structure. It let out a small giggle. This is, of course, foolish untruth. I think you are familiar with the maxim that the dream dreams the dreamer, or something similar, and while unrefined and simplistic, that statement is largely true. This world and others like it partially exist because of Incarnata, and the symbiotic relationship between my world and yours is a vital connection underpinning the continued existence of both. This has been true since the beginning, when the first of us were formed and began to dream, filling this place we had never visited with new ideas and emotions and life. You call me the hyena, and that is an apt name. I am the progenitor, the form, the idea for many things, including that child imago, animal that you call by the name hyena. If I didn't exist, neither would it, not just in its physical form, but all it represents. But again, it is not truly reciprocal, and the hyena in flesh or thought here does not represent me. I have given birth to many wonderful and terrible things in this world, and dreamed many dreamers to life. Its lips curled back in what might have been its horrific version of a smile as it ruminated a moment before going on, its eyes flaring brighter. The weavers do much of the work now, but I and my kind are much older, and the foundations of much that exists here and in Incarnata rests on what we brought into being. If we are lost or subjugated, the suffering in both this reality and mine would be unimaginable. Haha, pun intended. Which is one reason why, when Incarnata began to be taken over, many of us started to flee here. Or at least try. Some of us, especially the oldest and most powerful, have very little ability to survive here, as the stronger our ties to our realm, the harder it is to exist outside of it. A weaker, younger Incarnata might come here temporarily or even permanently if they are clever enough. They find thin places or open doors, cracks they can crawl through. You've seen plenty of those, haven't you? They sometimes call them nightmares, don't they? I nodded, tongue thick in my throat. They're coming from Incarnata, but that would not work for those of us with real power there. We have to find other methods. ways of gathering strength and making the full transition into this world. Feeling a new surge of anger, I interrupted him. By taking over a town and driving them all crazy, so they kill each other. The hyena's eyes flared again as it crossed its paws in front of it. Yes, I waited patiently, an aspect of myself in this hole for all these years, laying in the dark and listening for their approach. I knew it would work, but not how long it would take. And I did it not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. This was my way to escape the mark, or so I thought. I frowned at him. I don't know what the mark is. Not a what, but a who. A woman who spent decades slowly taking over large portions of Incarnata. She is trapped for now, but it will not last. She will escape and conquer again, and you'll be sending me back to her. I blinked. He was right. I wasn't there to kill him. I was supposed to. What? Give him the elixir and expel him back to Incarnata. I shuddered at the alien thoughts in my head, somehow worse than the voice of the hyena. Whatever we were working for, it had its hooks buried so deep that it was telling me what to do now. Not words exactly, but the ideas were clear enough. What the fuck was I doing here? I held up my hands. I don't know what's going on. So how about this? Fuck it, I don't think you're lying to me. Though why I feel that way, who the fuck knows? But you've told me more in 10 minutes than anyone else. So I'll let you go, or you let me go. Or whatever, and I fucking quit. And whoever I was working for can suck my dick, and I hope if they come down here for you, you beat their fucking ass. Just let us go and do whatever weird shit you're going to do. How does that sound? A fresh eruption of laughter from the hyena as his eyes danced between yellow and green before settling into a dark, cool blue. I knew I liked you, I won't eat you. And I appreciate the sentiment, but it's too late for all of that. Your master has already won. What do you mean? The hyena let out a small, tired sigh. I'm so tired. Doing all of this, pushing myself slightly into this reality, building enough influence to do what I've done here. It has all been done within the smallest of margins, and your work undoing that has undone me as well. I cannot win here, and fighting further will only weaken my chances of survival and freedom back on the other side. I found myself wanting to argue, as though I should be working to convince this monster who had killed or enslaved. God knew how many that he should keep at it. It was insane, but then everything was insane now, wasn't it? I was so lost and terrified that it became easy to just follow the steady current flowing through my head, pushing me to finish the job I had already begun. So you'll drink the elixir? The hyena snickered. Elixir, it's blood, you know. Or what passes for it. A more clever way out than mine, it seems. It stood up suddenly, towering over me as it padded a couple of steps closer. But yes, I'll drink it. The creature looked past me to the sheriff. Sleep. I turned and saw the man slumped to the floor, unconscious. I've told all of them to sleep, and they won't wake again until I'm gone. My influence will be gone too, but I can't speak for how they will act after so long and all they have done in my name. You would do well to leave quickly once this is done. Breath tight in my chest, I nodded. Okay, thank you, My words faded out as I pulled out the satchel and withdrew the elixir from it. Should I just? I was going to say pour it on the ground for you to lick up, but I stopped myself. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't an animal really, and however horrified I was at what it had done, I couldn't help but find myself in awe of it as well. It spoke up in my head. Just pour it onto my tongue. That should work fine. It lowered its head, tongue lolling out of a mouth big enough to swallow me whole. I heard its liquid laugh in my head as I recoiled a little. Don't be scared. I said I won't eat you and I don't lie. Let's just get it done. I gave him a shaky nod and poured out the flask's contents onto his tongue. I had the thought it might be a trick, that he'd spit it out, or that the elixir would do something different than my ma. My gut said it would. But the hyena was true to his word, curling his tongue back and swallowing without sparing a drop. As soon as he sat back, I felt another wave of confusing sadness. Had I done the right thing? I didn't know. Tears in the corners of my eyes, I looked up at the creature before me. I'm sorry. The hyena's eyes were still glowing a soft blue as it regarded me. Me too. You know, it's fun. Suddenly, its eyes felt dark as its fur and skin turned to grey stone. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the enormous statue left behind as I waited for some sign of new life or movement. There was none. Wiping my cheeks, I turned to the sheriff and took his gun from its holster before grabbing him under the armpits to begin the long process of dragging him back toward the elevator. I didn't say much to Holloman and Graves when I reached them outside. Told them it was done and that we needed to leave now before people started waking up crazy or looking for someone to blame. They didn't argue, and despite our exhaustion and Mrs. Graves' arm, we nearly ran back to where we'd left the car downtown. 10 minutes later, we were past the city limits sign and on our way to a hospital far enough away to not be affected by what had gone on in Braxton. We spent the next 4 hours waiting for them to treat Mrs. Graves, and when they finally came out to give us an update, they said that she was doing fine, but they needed to keep her overnight. We went back to see her before they carried her up to her new room, and she did look a little better, if still pale and exhausted. She smiled at us when we both offered to stay. No, you two go get some sleep. That's what I'm going to do too. Come back in the morning. I'll be fine. We didn't argue, and a few minutes later we were getting back in the car for Mr. Holloman to take me home. Cranking the car, Holloman paused before putting it in reverse. I looked over and he was staring at the steering wheel, his face unreadable. Clint, I just want to say that I'm very proud of you. You're a much braver man than I am, I think. And I don't know what we would have done without you back there. There was a time when I would have gloried in his praise, but too much had happened since then. Too much bullshit under the bridge, or whatever the saying would be. I was too exhausted to be clever, but in some ways I felt crystal clear. Take me to it. Holloman raised an eyebrow at me. Take you to what? You want to get something to eat, or... Stop the bullshit, you know what I mean. Take me to your boss, our boss. Show me what exactly it is we're serving. He puffed out a long breath as his face grew red. Clint, now is not the time or the place for this conversa. His words trailed off as he saw me pull the sheriff's revolver from my jacket pocket. I'm not asking this time, Gordon. You're taking me there, now. We rode in silence for about half an hour before Holloman spoke up again, his voice low but hard, as though he was chastising a misbehaving child during a church service. This is all unnecessary, you know, and it will take hours to reach it. We'll be driving half the night. I tightened my grip on the gun slightly, but kept staring out at the road ahead. That's okay. We have time. Mrs. Graves won't be ready for us to visit until in the morning, remember? He puffed out a breath and fell silent for a few moments, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer and calmer. What are you looking to get out of this, Clint? Do you think getting answers will make things better? Because take it from me, knowing more isn't always a good thing. Turning to look at him, Holloman's face looked drawn and old in the late afternoon light. We were out on a rural highway, stands of trees on both sides blocking much of the sun, as we pushed through patches of bright and dark on the way to what? I wasn't sure. I didn't know if even a gun would make him take me to the right place anyway, and I realized in that moment that some of that was my fault. I had been so focused on what Holloman and Graves meant to me, authority, employment, a door to a better, or at least more interesting, world than I'd known all my life. But how much did I know about them, really? And if I was going to stay ahead of them, didn't I need to understand them? Why are you doing this? He glanced my way and frowned. What do you mean? I mean, you and Gracie talk about serving and helping people and all that, but why are you doing it really? You never talk about it, how you got into this, and why you both put yourselves and each other at risk. His lips had drawn down into a tight line as I spoke, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to answer at all. When he did, it was slower and more measured, like he was weighing every word before letting it fall from his lips. I grew up as a very lonely boy. I was smart and, well, my father called me bookish, though to him I think it was somewhat of a pejorative term. I didn't have many friends or much family, and like many who have good imaginations and a desire for life to be different than it is, I found myself drawn to those things that hinted at some other, better world than the one I lived in. Smiling weakly, he gave a slight shrug. When I was young, it was Bigfoot and aliens. The Loch Ness Monster and magic, and, well, anything else I could find. Back then there was no internet, so I spent plenty of time at the library and mail ordering those things I could find that seemed exotic and worth the money I'd saved up to buy them. He snorted. Most of it was trash, of course. Semi-literate diatribes written by lunatics or charlatans. People that fed or preyed on the very urge that drove me. To belong and to be special by finding a hidden world behind the world. Not just for the promise of what such a new magical world might hold, but because it justified my failure at finding a place in this one. His voice grew softer. It wasn't because I was weak or unlikable. It was because I was meant for something wonderful. Something better. I'd sat the gun in my lap while he talked, and now I felt guilty for having pulled it in the first place. But no, I couldn't trust him, not yet anyway. And what did it say that I had to pull a gun for him to show me the truth? Still, hearing the embarrassed pain in his voice, I couldn't help but speak up when he fell silent. Shit, man, everybody feels that way sometimes. Why do you think people do all the crazy shit they do? Worship celebrities and want to be famous. They want proof that they don't suck and that people like them. Love them, even. He nodded. You're right, of course. But just like everyone else, my pain was tailor-made for me. It fit me well and traveled along wherever I went. When I went to college, I thought things might change, but it was largely the same. Before long, I retreated back to searching for something more, now with the resources of a nascent adult surrounded by enormous libraries and a few strangers that shared a love of the strange. Much of it was still bullshit, of course. The 3 L's I used to call them. The lonelies, the loonies, and the liars. The fact that I counted myself among them only made me hate them more, not less, but any contempt I felt was outweighed by my hunger to find something real. He glanced my way again. His eyebrow arched, and eventually I did. A few small things at first, but I was like a desperate prospector that finally gets a bit of gold in his plate. That taste only makes the hunger worse, as it confirms that you've been right all along. So I kept pushing, edging into groups that were stranger, yes, but I'd developed a keen nose for the bullshit by that point, and I'd keep moving when there was nothing real to be found. I stepped into the borderlands of several things, but secret things are secret for a reason, and frequently I'd either run into an obstacle I couldn't overcome, or the leads would just dry up. I was out of college and working by that point, and nearly all my resources were being funneled toward my extracurricular activities, but they were still limited. And by my mid-30s I'd grown increasingly bitter and despondent. Despite the fact that I'd cultivated a network of contacts and knowledge that had put me deeper into those hidden worlds than my younger self would have ever dreamed possible. It was never enough, you understand, because it was still always me looking in from the outside. Then 3 things happened within less than a year that changed my life forever. The first was that I met a small group that was very close to making contact back with something that they called the Dreamer. The second was that I met Gracie, and the third was that I was diagnosed with terminal cancer. I turned back and stared at him. How long ago was that? He chuckled. Just about 24. No, 25 years ago. I was 39 at the time. I nodded slowly. So, what, you beat the cancer? Because you don't look sick, and that's a long time to, you know. He gave me a wan smile. Live with terminal cancer? Yeah, I know, and I did beat it after a fashion. But that's getting ahead of myself. Gripping the steering wheel harder, Holloman continued. When I found out about the cancer, I was coming off the best 6 months of my life. I'd found a group that had claimed to have contact with the Dreamer, some kind of supernatural power and I didn't fully understand. What I did understand is that they weren't lying or crazy, at least not all of them. How did you know that it wasn't lies or bullshit? He paused a moment, licking his lips before he went on. I'm good at reading that stuff, like I said, but this time it was more than that." He trailed off a moment before continuing. "A friend of mine once told me a story when I asked something similar. Once upon a time there was a king that wanted to see God. So he sent out his knights and pages to all corners of his kingdom to see if anyone could help him. Now he was a respected king, but he was also rightfully feared, and out of all the land only 3 men came forward to offer their aid. The first was a big fat man who was quick to smile and easy to talk. He strolled into the throne room, gave a deep bow, and then waited for the king to ask his question. "Can you take me to see God?" The fat man immediately began to nod and laugh. Yes, he said, he'd be happy to take the king to see God. There would be the matter of expenses for all the preparations, of course, but they should be able to make the journey in a year's time. The king listened to his response intently and then gestured to the guards. The man was taken down to the courtyard and beheaded that very afternoon. A week passed, and then a thin, wretched man came shuffling into the castle saying he could help the king. He was granted audience, and while the stranger kept looking in every direction and jumping at every shadow, the king got his attention long enough to make his inquiry. "Can you take me to see God?" Lips trembling, the man looked around at the silent guards and advisors in the throne room before nodding to the king. He said that he could take the king to see God, but only if he didn't bring all these laughing demons with him when they went. The king listened to him sympathetically, and then had him gently poisoned late that night. Words of these deaths spread far and wide, and more than 2 months passed before another soul dared enter the castle with word of how God could be seen. When they finally came, it was a young man who had been a soldier in the king's last campaign. Word was he had been a loyal and brave fighter until he lost half his arm and almost died to infection. And in the past 2 years he'd worked as a farmer in his family's land amid the northern mountains. Hearing all of this, the king dreaded what the boy might say and what action might be required, and so he asked more questions this time. "Tell me, boy, do you come to me with tricks and lies? Because I chopped the head off the last liar that came to this throne." The boy, still kneeling with his eyes down, shook his head. "No, my king, I do not lie, least of all to you." The king nodded. "Very well. Are you beset by some insanity that makes you see the world differently than it is?" "Because I put to sleep the last pitiful lunatic that came to this throne." Shaking slightly now, the boy shook his head harder this time. "I do not claim to be wise, but I am not a fool, and I have no doubt that I know the truth when I see it." Leaning forward, the king was surprised to find that he was actually getting excited now. Could this finally be what he was looking for? I see. Then let me ask this. Have you seen God?" The boy was shaking harder now, but his voice was still strong. "I have, my king, up in the mountains beyond my home. I have seen God there." The king stood up from his throne, barely maintaining his composure as he asked his next question. "And will you take me to see God?" The boy looked up and met the king's eyes now, his face filled with surprised horror. "Oh no, my king, I will tell you where to go, but I will never take you there." So taken aback and disappointed at someone daring to tell him no, the king didn't even get angry at the boy's refusal. Instead, he kneeled down in front of the boy, his normally gruff voice soft and beseeching now. "Why, boy? Why won't you take me there yourself?" The boy never blinked, and only when the king lowered his own gaze did the young soldier answer him. "Because I have been there, I have seen God, and I will not return to that place." The king frowned at him, his voice rougher again now and pregnant with threat. "Are you not afraid of displeasing your king?" The boy gave a short, hollow laugh, meaning no disrespect, but I fear only one thing. You don't understand why that isn't you, but go on up that mountain. You'll understand soon enough. Holloman's face looked paler when he glanced at me next. These people I'd met, they hadn't been up the mountain, but they'd gotten close enough that their excitement had turned to an awed fear that was so deep it was instinctual. It was unnerving, and before long I found that animal cowardice infecting me as well. He let out a dry laugh. "But then I met a girl. Gracie was better than me in every way, kinder, smarter, more courageous. I felt like a fraud around her, like any moment she'd figure out how much less I was and run away. When I realized she actually had similar interests to my own, a thirst for the extraordinary she called it, I was ecstatic. This was something where I had the advantage, where I could offer her something most could not. And that is why with her, I sought out the dreamer and faced what we found. It wasn't anything like what I expected, of course. None of it was. When we finally left its presence, we had been asked to serve. Asked, not told, which seemed like an important distinction at the time, though now I'm not so sure. Gracie was all for it from the start, but I was far less certain. Part of it was my base cowardice raising its yellow head, but more than that was fear of losing her. We didn't understand what we'd be doing at that point, not really. Just that an entity beyond our full comprehension was asking us to help it with important work that would help the world. But where she saw exciting purpose, I saw unknown danger and dread. I didn't want to risk losing her to it, though I also feared losing her if I didn't go along with what she clearly wanted. This lasted for nearly a month of me, stalling for more time and trying to settle her of my fears if we entered into some covenant with the dreamer. And then one day I started seeing blood. Holloman rubbed his face. I won't bore you with all the details of the next few weeks of tests and worry. Long story short, they said I had a few months left. I was shattered, wanted to give up. Tried to break up with Gracie because I knew losing me would only hurt worse if she was there for the end. But I saw a tear at the corner of his eye. Not my girl, she told me to shut up. That we were going to fix it. That the dreamer was going to fix it if it was so powerful and wanted our help. When he sat silent for several moments, I spoke up. It cured you. He nodded as he turned down a street. I saw that we were in an industrial part of a town I didn't recognize. How much time had, but then he was speaking again. Oh yes, like the cancer was never there. And the gratitude I felt, well, there wasn't much I wouldn't do at that point, and such a demonstration of its power also made me feel safer about doing its. Well, bidding sounds dramatic, but that doesn't make it inapt. Not that we minded. We were helping people, and we were part of something special, and we were doing it together. And then when we had Nicholas, well, things were perfect for a time. He shook his head as he came to a hard stop. But enough of that, we're here. I blinked, looking at him, and then out at the building we were in front of. It said Corbett Textiles in a faded sign across the front, but there was no sign of light or life anywhere other than the dim streetlights crookedly leaning over the broken asphalt we drove up on. I had so many questions I wanted to ask now. Who was Nicholas, their kid? And I didn't get the sense they were still married or together or whatever, so what had happened between them? But all of that had to wait. I needed to get this question answered once and for all. This is where the dreamer is? Holloman inclined his head slightly as he kept staring out the window. Are you going to take me in? He smiled slightly. Oh no, I'm not going back in there. I frowned at him. Why not? His expression was cold and unreadable as he turned to look at me with his tight, thin smile. You'll understand soon enough. He was right, though not in the way I first thought. Coming back out of the building 3 hours later, my mind was such a jumble I could barely talk when I climbed back into the car. It wasn't until the next night when I was trapped and terrified with Gracie that I was able to put into words what had happened in there, and by then it was too late. For the time being, I used what words I had to tell him we had to go back. We had to go back and get Gracie now. That something was after her, and she wasn't safe. He didn't question me, but just floored it back toward the hospital, calling ahead to tell the nurses that some crazy had called and made threats to harm her. And he expected security to be in her room around the clock until we returned, or they were all going to get sued until the lights went dark. I couldn't hear their responses, but he seemed slightly calmer when he finally hung up from talking to the third person in hospital administration. The next 2 hours were some of the longest of my life. It was a miracle that we didn't get stopped for speeding several times over. but something seemed to be watching over us as we navigated the dark roads back to Gracie. When we finally got there, we found that she was okay, at least for the moment. An old security guard was sitting in a plastic chair outside her room, and after some argument, the nurses agreed to let one of us stay in the room with her overnight. Gordon told me to head on back down to the car and get some sleep, that he'd slept some while I was inside. Well, when I was inside. I thought he was lying, but I didn't feel like it was my place to argue either. So I told him to call me if he needed to swap out, and I went back outside to wait. Getting into the car, I saw the gun laying discarded in the passenger floorboard. I hadn't even thought about it on the way back, and didn't specifically remember when I set it down or let it go. Not that it mattered anymore. We were doing what we needed to do. Coming back here and keeping her safe. Getting her out of here as soon as. I jumped as my phone buzzed and woke me up. It was daylight, a little after 9 by the dash clock, and Holloman was calling me. Fumbling with the phone, I hit the accept button and started asking if everything was okay. Holloman's voice on the other side was tired-sounding but calm. "Fine. Everything is fine. About to be wheeling her out if you'll pull up front and help me get her into the car. They gave her a sedative for pain and she's a bit out of it." Sure. Heading over there now." 15 minutes later, they were wheeling her out, and Gordon hadn't been lying. Her head was lolling to the side as the nurse pushed her out to the curb. She saw my concerned look and gave me a smile. Poor thing. It hit her a bit harder than we expected, but she should be awake in an hour or two. And she's already checked out and ready to go. Your father has all the prescriptions and instructions for her wounds. I went to correct her, but then decided against it. What difference did it make? Instead, I helped pick up Gracie and ease her over into the passenger seat while Gordon went around to the driver's side. It was as he was going around the front of the car that Gracie suddenly grabbed me around the neck with surprising strength, whispering to me before her grip loosened and then fell away. I tried to keep my face neutral as I buckled her in and pondered the word. Kiriath. I'd heard that word before recently, but I couldn't remember where. And I had no idea why it was so important to Gracie that she'd made a point of whispering it to me through the fog of her sedation. Looking up, I saw Gordon staring at me. "Did she say something to you?" I shook my head as I backed out of the car. "No, just mumbling. I think she's dreaming." A pause and then, "Okay, get in and we'll go." Reaching for the back door, I felt my phone buzz. The name said Wallace Minter. I felt a stab of worry and guilt. I'd told him to call if he ever needed anything, and I'd meant to check on him more frequently, but it had been months since we last talked. Still, last time I'd heard from him, he was doing, well, not great, but okay. I'd have to call him back, but now wasn't the time. There was too much going on. Refusing the call, I got into the back seat and looked up front to where Gordon was staring at me in the mirror. "Ready?" I nodded. "Yeah, but are we driving all the way back right now? Is she okay for that long?" He shook his head. "No, I wouldn't want to risk it. She needs to lie down, but we actually have a place less than an hour away. Haven't been there in a good while, but it should be just what we need." I stared at him. "Really? I never knew you had another place this close to Braxton." Holloman shrugged. "We're 3 hours from Braxton, and it's just never been relevant until now. If you're done with the questions, I'd like to focus on driving. I'm quite tired and don't want to make a mistake." Frowning, I shrugged. "Yeah, fine. Let me know if you want me to drive." Sinking back into the seat, I stared out the window. There was a part of me that still wanted to argue or question everything more, not that it wasn't possible for them to have multiple properties. But it all just seemed so strange and coincidental. On the other hand, my brain was fried, and between trying to wrap my head around what I'd seen the night before and everything else, I didn't really have the energy to fight anymore. Instead, I sank into a stupor as we passed through a couple of small towns, and then a third, finally coming to a stop on the eastern edge of a place that I'd never been before, but still seemed strangely familiar. The neighborhood had seen better days. but Gordon had pulled up in the driveway of the one place on the street that looked clean and in good repair. A two-story house with a well-kept yard and fresh paint. I felt a small tickle in the back of my head as we got out, and Holloman began searching the yard like he'd lost something there. Didn't he say they hadn't been there in a long time? Still, they could be paying someone to keep the place up, right? And what the fuck was he doing? Gordon suddenly stood up, holding a rock that, upon him turning it over, was actually a hider key. Giving me a small, strange smile, he popped the key free and went up to open the door before coming back to help me carry Carrie Gracie inside. She was limp but snoring, and while she didn't seem in distress, I still shot him a worried look as we started up on the porch. Should she be sleeping this heavy? He puffed out a breath of exertion as he climbed the steps. She's always been sensitive to sedatives. She should be fine in an hour or two. Just need to get her inside and comfortable. Okay, I was going to say more, but something caught my eye as we were crossing the threshold into the house. A little sign hung outside the door, carved and painted in the shape of a small dock with a fisherman on the end casting his line into some unknown sea. Underneath the dock was a wood placard that said Willie's Place. I stopped dead for a moment. Who the fuck was Willie? Holloman frowned at me. Don't drop her. What are you doing? I shook my head and started forward again. A few minutes later, and we had her settled in what I thought was the downstairs living room, but it was hard to say. There was furniture throughout the house, but it was odd and mismatched, like someone had taken things from a dozen houses instead of one. Can you stay with her? I looked away from the weird old TV I'd been staring at and looked at him. Yeah, sure. Are you leaving? He nodded, just for a bit. He pulled some papers from his pocket and waved them. Got to go get her medicines filled. I'll pick us up some food too. Okay, yeah, sure, I'll keep an eye on her. He started to leave and then paused a second. Thank you, Clint. I really do mean that. For everything. I just wish, if she wakes up, tell her that she's home and safe. And that everything will be okay. Can you do that for me? Yeah, sure, I'll tell her. I sat on the floor next to the sofa for the next half hour. God, even then I hated that place. It was boring, and I had no phone service in there, but the worst part was how creepy everything was. Even now, after everything else, I still dream that I'm back in that place. The peeling wallpaper, the lonely, almost angry buzz that was in the air and the light of every room. A sense of sadness and wrongness that made my skin tingle, and was made so much worse by the furniture and other items scattered across the rooms with some chaotic sense of insanity or something worse. Weird shit like the old-timey television. Looking closer, you could see ripples in the screen's glass like someone had run their fingers through thick icing. The sofa Gracie was on, it smelled. It smelled like skin. It looked like fabric, but it fucking smelled like a woman's skin. And then there was the rocking horse. I don't know why it stood out to me the most, but sitting across the room near the entrance to the hallway was an old wooden rocking horse with peeling paint and a faded head of molded plastic that once had looked like a charging black stallion. The saddle was the oddest part, while the rest of it looked weathered. The leather saddle was polished and pristine, and I could even read the gold lettering above the stirrup. Nick's best steed. Who the fuck was? Oh God, oh no. I jumped at Gracie's voice behind and above me, and when I looked back I saw she was sitting up, looking around in horror. Turning around, I put my hand on her arm. Gracie, Mrs. Graves, it's okay. Mr. Holloman is going to be back soon, and you're okay. No, 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 no. She looked terrified, eyes shining wetly as she looked to me in the room and back over and over again. He says we're safe. He wanted me to tell you that you're home. She squeezed her eyes shut as she lowered her head, and when she spoke this time, it was a brief, broken whisper. I know. What do you mean, you know? Gracie sniffed as she kept her head down. This was our house, or it's not really, but it looks like some nightmare version of it. Parts of it familiar, parts of it twisted or taken from other places. Her hands trembled as she dry-washed them over and over in her lap. the rasping of her skin seeming to fall into rhythm with the short, panicked breaths she was taking. It's what happens when it comes to a place and infects it. Gordon calls it the Hollow House. I stared at her, speechless for a moment, my brain filled with so many questions I wasn't sure where to start. Seeing her like this, I wanted to be as gentle as I could, but I needed to understand what was happening and why she was so terrified. Still, maybe it'd be easier if we just left first and then talked about it. Putting my hand on top of hers, I stopped their motion and gave them a squeeze. If you want and you feel able, we can leave and talk about this somewhere else. Mr. Holloman should be back soon and we can wait outside while I call him to come on. She opened her eyes and gave me a sad smile. No, you don't understand, Clint. I don't think it will let us out. Not this time, not yet anyway. It's not a coincidence that Gordon brought us to a place this thing is inhabiting. And I'm assuming it didn't start looking like this after he left. I could see some dim, desperate hope in her face, but I had to be honest. This was too important. No, it was like this when we came in. And then he said he needed to leave to get your medicine and us some food. My tongue felt thick in my mouth. He trapped us in here, didn't he? A new tear ran down her cheek. I'm afraid so. Go check the doors and windows, but I'm guessing we're stuck until, well, I don't really know. I did as she asked, and she was right. There were 2 doors out of the place, and they were both sealed shut. The wood of the door and the plaster of the walls running together like melted wax turned to stone. Same for the windows, which wouldn't even scratch when I broke a chair against it. Sweaty, angry, and terrified, I went back into the living room where she sat on the sofa staring over at the rocking horse. You were right. No cell service, no way out. That motherfucker has trapped us here. But why? I felt like something has been off about him. But what is all of this? Why would he do this to us? When she looked at me, her face was a complex mixture of sadness and anger. And though I knew it wasn't directed at me, it still made my heart pound a bit harder when I heard the cold rage in her voice. He's doing it because he thinks it will give us back our son. I think I knew I loved Gordon the first time I met him. We met outside a bookstore, you know. Not one of these commercial things that are dying off now, but a real bookstore with a love for books and words and knowledge. Forgotten, out-of-print books that you couldn't find most places, filled with stories and ideas and truths that most people have never known. I'd always been drawn to those kinds of secret truths, and it was when I was rifling through bargain tables outside looking for something special and new that I found Gordon. He was older than me, but he had this light, this energy. Part of it was his intellect, but more than that was his passion. I could tell that he was nervous talking to me, but he was excited too, not just because I think he liked me as much as I did him, but because he had found someone to talk to about the things that, at least to him, really mattered. It started off with us talking about interesting books we had read, then us having lunch and talking about ourselves and our interests. Over the next couple of weeks, he told me more and more about his more exotic social circles and beliefs, and to my surprise, I found myself more drawn to him the deeper we went. He introduced me to the concept of the dreamer. It's what we call the thing we all now serve, and together we found it, and, after some discussion, and a developing urgent need to help Gordon, we entered into an agreement with it, to find these invaders, these nightmares, and exorcise them, capture them, before they are free in the world to do more harm. And for some time life was very good. We both had a thirst for the extraordinary, and our work for the dreamer gave us a steady stream of excitement and new understanding of how things really work. It was terrifying at times, but we never faltered or failed. We had the blessing of our new benefactor, and we were both smart enough to follow every instruction perfectly. So we always captured our quarry and fulfilled our duties. That was one of our mistakes, of course. We became arrogant and complacent, assuming that we could not fail because we had yet to do so. But back then we were so happy all the time. We had each other and our work, and the sharing of our secret life with each other made everything even more special. We made a home and married. 2 years later, I had our child. We named him Nicholas after my father. Things were so good, in fact, that I began to worry. Something had to go wrong, didn't it? Either we would learn that there was more to the dreamer than the good intentions it professed, or Gordon's health would go down, or something. I tried not to share my concerns with Gordon, but I think he saw the shadow growing in my heart. At the time I felt guilty, like my worry was a symptom of me not being grateful enough for the magical life we had. A life that we were so perfect for that we could face down evil again and again and win every time. Until, of course, we lost. It was on a ranch in Wyoming. An old man had been overtaken, and his younger brother had enough contacts to track down non-traditional solutions, which ultimately lead him to us. They were a nice family. I remember the old man's daughter and son-in-law were there. They had twin baby girls, but they'd flown up to the ranch and took care of him, while various doctors and medicine men came and went trying to find a way to bring him away from the strange, dark path he was headed down. By the time we reached him, he'd been locked in his bedroom for nearly a week. Not by his choice, but his brother's. You see, he tried to stab his own daughter the last time he was free. The uncle went in with a couple of the ranch hands and held him down when we were ready, tying him to the bed and only leaving us alone when we promised to call if anything went amiss. We reassured them that we had done this many times and that everything was well in hand. We were such arrogant fools. When the thing inside him escaped, it didn't touch me or Gordon at all. Instead, it trapped us in that room while it slaughtered the entire family and everyone else outside, even the little babies sleeping in a spare room. We could hear all of it, the screaming and the ripping, and worst of all, its terrible, terrible laughter. And when it was done, the door swung open and the hot stink of what it had done across that house poured in. We burned the house and everything in it. It was long gone, and there was no use in leaving some trace that could tie us to the slaughter of an entire family. We went home by back roads, stopping periodically to cry and scream and assure each other that we were done with it, with all of it. It was just talk, of course, and we both knew it. I wouldn't risk Gordon getting sick again, and he wouldn't stop if I wanted to continue. Even beyond that, our work with the dreamer had become our lives, our whole identity. What were we without it? How did we matter? It took 2 days to get back home, and by then we'd stopped with the tears and reassurances. We were instead talking about how we'd be more careful going forward. Not make any mistakes, that we had too much to lose, not just our exciting life, but each other and our sweet boy. I held Nicholas as we rode back from my mother's house, and I felt some shame that my first panic thoughts of loss had only been about Gordon and the dreamer, and not him. He was so small and precious and helpless, and how would he fare in this world if we died on one of these trips? Squeezing him tight, I resolved to talk more to Gordon about everything the next morning. We would try to strike a new bargain with the dreamer, one where we found a way to still help people without being at such personal risk. It might be hard and frightening, but we needed to find a better path forward to keep our family safe. And like a fool, I entered our home with a degree of comfort and confidence that, though the next few days might be difficult, we would get through it and come out the other side together and whole. Because, despite everything we had done and seen, I still ignorantly believed I knew how things worked. And I labored under the illusion that we were somehow special and safe, uniquely capable of staring into the face of these horrors without real danger. We had seen horrors from another world and an entire family slaughtered, but we were still safe and standing. Sure we were. So we walked into the trap that had been laid blindly, carried our son in there, because we couldn't fathom the one thing that should have been obvious from the start. The idea that should have terrified us from the first time we confronted one of these creatures. That the thing that had crawled from the old man's body and made us listen as it butchered his whole family. That thing had followed us home. We were exhausted when we got home, and other than taking care of Nick and spending time together, we didn't do much for the next couple of days. Not so much as try to step outside. Part of it was the fatigue, but only part. We were also terrified, in shock and horror from what we'd just lived through and in dread of what was ahead of us. Because we'd discussed it, Gordon and I, and we knew things had to change. This world was getting more dangerous the deeper we sunk into it, and we had to find a new way of pleasing our benefactor while keeping our family safe. It sounded reasonable when we said it in hushed tones amongst ourselves, but I could see my own fear reflected in Gordon's eyes. Fear of reprisal or worse, rejection, and what that might mean for our miraculous little life together. So we stayed inside, spent time together as a family. In some ways, it was a really magical time. I remember having the thought at one point, I think we were laughing over a board game at the time, that it was as if we were living in some wonderful snow globe, protected and separate from the darkness of the world outside. I didn't know how right I was. On the third day, I woke up to the sound of panicked, breathless cursing at the front of the house. It was Gordon, tugging on the doors and windows, so angry and scared that it took me asking what was wrong several times before he even registered it and turned to look at me, eyes wide as dinner plates. "It's the house, Gracie. None of the doors will open. Windows neither. Not like they're stuck, but like they were never made to be opened." Something so strange should have brought questions or doubts, but I had none. I trusted Gordon. He was no fool or coward, and if he was that close to losing control, well, there wasn't really anything to discuss. We just needed to get out. So I picked up a fireplace poker and started trying to break or pry open a window or door. When that didn't work, I got a softball bat from the closet. Then an electric drill. You could chip paint and scratch wood, but nothing deep. And if you went back a few minutes later to an old wound, you'd find it flowed together again, like running wax. Of course, by then we were starting to discuss things more. If brute force wasn't going to be the answer, then we needed to figure out what had caused this. We discussed options both mundane and otherwise over the next couple of hours. Nick had woken up by this point, so we had to keep the tone light and act to him like Gordon and I were playing some kind of strange game. My smile and laughter seemed painfully brittle as we went over different possible scenarios. Had we been drugged? Was there some gas leak or toxin causing us to hallucinate? It seemed unlikely, as we were seeing the same things and weren't noticing any strange behavior in each other or Nick. Was there something supernaturally wrong with the house? While neither of us were against the idea of a house being haunted, we'd never had any sign of anything strange there before. But if what we were seeing was, in fact, real, we'd gone past the point of it making sense without it being paranormal somewhere between him breaking the poker against a window and me drilling into the sealed back door with no effect. The most obvious cause was right in front of us the whole time, of course. Or right behind us, maybe. But as my grandfather used to say, we were circling like flies dancing around a pile of shit. Neither of us wanted it to be connected to the work, especially not to the last job, to the thing that slaughtered that whole family. But when we'd run out of ways to circle, it was Gordon that said it first. His face was still stiff with fear, but the anger was gone now. In its place was a sickly dread that made my stomach curdle as he said the words. "It followed us home, didn't it?" I wanted to argue, but instead I nodded. "I think so, yes." I lowered my voice, though I didn't know that it would make any real difference. "We have to get out of here. We have to get Nick out of here." Gordon's face darkened slightly. "What do you think?" He shook his head. "No, I'm sorry. You're right, of course. Nothing we've tried has worked, so we need to think of something we haven't." Hand trembling, I pushed a sweaty strand of hair out of my face. "Do you think it knows we're here? Our master?" I usually avoided referring to it in such unvarnished terms, mostly because the idea of giving myself over so much to something so unknown was terrifying to me. But now wasn't the time for word games or illusions. I saw Gordon note the word in his expression before giving me a slow, tired shrug. "I don't know, Grace, maybe. Maybe it knows, but can't do anything about it. It clearly didn't stop it from happening if we're right about the source of this." He gestured around at the room. "This trap. Shaking his head, he sat down on the floor. Or maybe it just doesn't care. My tongue felt thick as I swallowed down his words. We'd become so comfortable and confident in our special, protected status that even when we were scared, we were never hopeless. We assumed that the dangers would be overcome, either by us or by our benefactor. But what if it had cast us aside? Or what if it wanted to help, but was just powerless to do so? But no, hadn't it saved Gordon? Hadn't it protected us from afar countless times before? Even the rituals we did were largely just acts of showmanship for the clients. That and well, maybe a showing of faith and trust on our part as well. We should pray. Gordon glanced up at me with a frown. What? To the master. I nodded. Maybe it will reach him. He puffed out a breath as he looked up at the ceiling. I don't know, Gracie. We don't worship it. We just work for it. I don't know what you think that would do. I felt anger flare up in my belly, fueled by frustration and fear. I think that we don't have the luxury of discarding ideas because they make us uncomfortable, and that the time for semantics is past. Whatever else we are its servants, and we don't know unless we try. Falling to my knees, I clasped my hands tightly in a knot, heart pounding in my chest as I tried to find the right way to start. Gordon wasn't entirely wrong. We didn't worship it, not really. But I still felt like I needed to phrase things like I was speaking to a god. Please hear us, please help us. Shelter us from this thing that has befallen us. This thing that has trapped us while doing your work on your behalf. We've been diligent servants, and we appreciate all the blessings and protections you have given us. Please find us and help us now. I looked over to find Gordon had come to kneel next to me, his eyes wet and gleaming as he met my own. Voice thick, he echoed the last of my words. Please find us, help us, please. Behind us, a voice blossomed in the dark. It will not help you or find you. Not here, only I'm with you. So if you must pray, pray to me. We both turned toward the sound, my whole body shaking with fear. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but I actually felt a pang of disappointment when I didn't see anything at all. But then no, that wasn't quite right. Because the far corner of the room was darker, wasn't it? A cobweb of shadow that clung to every surface, as though the light was afraid to go any farther in. Looking into that shadow, I tried to keep my voice steady as I responded. What do you want? What do you want from us to set us free? The darkness seemed to shift and swell slightly before deepening into a thicker patch of impossible night. What do you think I want, silly? Its voice had been loud and harsh coming from the corner of the room, but was soft as silk when it moved next to my ear. A sacrifice. It has to be me. Gordon and I had been sitting together in the kitchen. It was a silly attempt at privacy, of course. The thing that had trapped us in our home was, at least so far as we could tell, everywhere. Still, being in the living room with that unnatural patch of shadow made my skin crawl, and I could tell Gordon was relieved when I suggested we move before talking. It hadn't said anything more after a sacrifice, but I think we both instinctively knew what that meant. One of us had to stay, to keep it company, or serve it, or feed it. I was already trying to find the best way to broach the topic when Gordon volunteered himself. I felt my eyes widen as blood began to pound in my ears. What? No, Gordon. There has to be another. We'll figure out something. His face hardened briefly, his eyebrows furrowing as he prepared to give some harsh rebuttal, some argument as to why he was right. But then his face crumpled, tears coming to his eyes as he looked at me pleadingly. Gracie, I'm no good for him. Not compared to you, and I can't bear the idea of you being stuck in here. He lowered his head as his eyes sank to the table. I won't. I knew the him meant Nick. Gordon meant to stay, but he also didn't even consider any other possibility. Just saving me and Nick. Swallowing hard, I reached out and stroked the top of his head. I know, sweetie, I know. You're such a good man. I think we need to ask some more questions of it first, okay? See if we can figure out something else. It may be that we're jumping to conclusions, or there's some way out of it that isn't so bad. He looked doubtful when he looked up at me, but not without hope. That was enough. Taking his hand, I gave it a squeeze and led him back into the living room. The darkness was still crouched in its corner, and I could feel it watching us as we approached. There was a kind of happy hatred radiating from it that made me want to vomit, but I pushed the feeling down. I couldn't shake or stammer or falter. Not then. I had one chance to do this, if it was going to work at all. "Have you made your decision?" I could feel Gordon tensing, and I was terrified that he would speak before I could. Maybe he even tried, but once I started yelling out the words, they were all I could hear. Each syllable filled up my ears, the room, the world. "We offer our son, Nicholas, as sacrifice." The final word was still spilling from my mouth when everything changed at once. There was a roar of laughter from the darkness, and then we were outside the house, just the two of us. I gasped at the suddenly bright air even as Gordon wrenched his hand away from mine. When I turned to look at him, I felt my heart break. I'd never expected my Gordon to look at me like that, not even in that moment. "What did you do? What the fuck did you do?" I hated you right then. Grace and I both jumped at the sound of Gordon's voice at the edge of the living room. I'd been so focused on her words I hadn't heard him come in. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in the last few hours. "I still loved you, of course. Always, but that just made how much I hated you worse." I glanced back at Grace, who had teared up several times in telling me the story. She was crying freely now as she nodded. "I know, sweetheart, I knew you might. But I couldn't lose you. As much as I loved our little boy, I loved you more." Gordon's voice was thick as he stepped into the room further. "I know, and if I was stronger, maybe we could have stayed together all the years since. If I had been willing to do what was necessary." He wiped at his eyes. "But now I am." Seeing this exchange, I felt sadness for these two people that I cared for more than I wanted to admit. I felt hurt at Gordon's betrayal of both of us, and maybe even a little at Grace's sacrifice all those years ago. But the sadness and pain was small next to my anger, an anger that seemed deeper than the well within me, though I didn't fully understand why. "What are you planning to do, Gordon? What is needed now, you think? Another sacrifice?" My harsh tone would have normally sent Gordon into an angry fit, but this time he just gave me a sad smile. "Not a sacrifice this time, Clint. A trade." He gestured to the room and then to me. "One son for another." We were exhausted when we got home, and other than taking care of Nick and spending time together, we didn't do much for the next couple of days. Not so much as try to step outside. Part of it was the fatigue, but only part. We were also terrified, in shock and horror from what we just lived through, and in dread of what was ahead of us. Because we'd discussed it, Gordon and I, and we knew things had to change. This world was getting more dangerous the deeper we sunk into it, and we had to find a new way of pleasing our benefactor, while keeping our family safe. It sounded reasonable when we said it in hushed tones amongst ourselves, but I could see my own fear reflected in Gordon's eyes. Fear of reprisal, or worse, rejection, and what that might mean for our miraculous little life together. So we stayed inside, spent time together as a family. In some ways, it was a really magical time. I remember having the thought at one point, I think we were laughing over a board game at the time, that it was as if we were living in some wonderful snow globe, protected and separate from the darkness of the world outside. I didn't know how right I was. On the third day, I woke up to the sound of panicked, breathless cursing at the front of the house. It was Gordon, tugging on the doors and windows, so angry and scared that it took me asking what was wrong several times before he even registered it, and turned to look at me, eyes wide as dinner plates. "It's the house, Gracie, None of the doors will open. Windows neither. Not like they're stuck, but like they were never made to be opened." Something so strange should have brought questions or doubts, but I had none. I trusted Gordon. He was no fool or coward, and if he was that close to losing control, well, there wasn't really anything to discuss. We just needed to get out. So I picked up a fireplace poker and started trying to break or pry open a window or door. When that didn't work, I got a softball bat from the closet, then an electric drill, You could chip paint and scratch wood, but nothing deep. And if you went back a few minutes later to an old wound, you'd find it had flowed together again like running wax. Of course, by then we were starting to discuss things more. If brute force wasn't going to be the answer, then we needed to figure out what had caused this. We discussed options both mundane and otherwise over the next couple of hours. Nick had woken up by this point, so we had to keep the tone light and act to him like Gordon and I were playing some kind of strange game. My smile and laughter seemed painfully brittle as we went over different possible scenarios. Had we been drugged? Was there some gas leak or toxin causing us to hallucinate? It seemed unlikely, as we were seeing the same things and weren't noticing any strange behavior in each other or Nick. Was there something supernaturally wrong with the house? While neither of us were against the idea of a house being haunted, we'd never had any sign of anything strange there before. But if what we were seeing was, in fact, real, we'd gone past the point of it making sense without it being paranormal somewhere between him breaking the poker against a window and me drilling into the sealed back door with no effect. The most obvious cause was right in front of us the whole time, of course. Or right behind us, maybe, but as my grandfather used to say, we were circling like flies dancing around a pile of shit. Neither of us wanted it to be connected to the work, especially not to the last job, to the thing that slaughtered that whole family. But when we'd run out of ways to circle, it was Gordon that said it first. His face was still stiff with fear, but the anger was gone now. In its place was a sickly dread that made my stomach curdle as he said the words. It followed us home, didn't it? I wanted to argue, but instead I nodded. I think so, yes. I lowered my voice, though I didn't know that it would make any real difference. We have to get out of here. We have to get Nick out of here. Gordon's face darkened slightly. What do you think? He shook his head. No, I'm sorry. You're right, of course. Nothing we've tried has worked, so we need to think of something we haven't. Hand trembling, I pushed a sweaty strand of hair out of my face. Do you think it knows we're here? Our master. I usually avoided referring to it in such unvarnished terms, mostly because the idea of giving myself over so much to something so unknown was terrifying to me. But now wasn't the time for word games or illusions. I saw Gordon note the word in his expression before giving me a slow, tired shrug. I don't know, Grace, maybe. Maybe it knows, but can't do anything about it. It clearly didn't stop it from happening if we're right about the source of this. He gestured around at the room. This trap. Shaking his head, he sat down on the floor. Or maybe it just doesn't care. My tongue felt thick as I swallowed down his words. We'd become so comfortable and confident in our special protected status that even when we were scared, we were never hopeless. We assumed that the dangers would be overcome, either by us or by our benefactor. But what if it had cast us aside? Or what if it wanted to help, but was just powerless to do so? But no, hadn't it saved Gordon? Hadn't it protected us from afar countless times before? Even the rituals we did were largely just acts of showmanship for the clients. That, and well, maybe a showing of faith and trust on our part as well. We should pray. Gordon glanced up at me with a frown. What? To the master? I nodded. Maybe it will reach him. He puffed out a breath as he looked up at the ceiling. I don't know, Gracie. We don't worship it. We just work for it. I don't know what you think that would do. I felt anger flare up in my belly, fueled by frustration and fear. I think that we don't have the luxury of discarding ideas because they make us uncomfortable, and that the time for semantics is past. Whatever else we are its servants, and we don't know unless we try. Falling to my knees, I clasped my hands tightly in a knot, heart pounding in my chest as I tried to find the right way to start. Gordon wasn't entirely wrong. We didn't worship it, not really. But I still felt like I needed to phrase things like I was speaking to a god. Please hear us, please help us. Shelter us from this thing that has befallen us. This thing that has trapped us while doing your work on your behalf. We have been diligent servants, and we appreciate all the blessings and protections you have given us. Please find us and help us now. I looked over to find Gordon had come to kneel next to me, his eyes wet and gleaming as he met my own. Voice thick, he echoed the last of my words. "Please find us, help us, please." Behind us, a voice blossomed in the dark. "It will not help you or find you. Not here, only I am with you. So if you must pray, pray to me." We both turned toward the sound, my whole body shaking with fear. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but I actually felt a pang of disappointment when I didn't see anything at all. But then no, that wasn't quite right. Because the far corner of the room was darker, wasn't it? A cobweb of shadow that clung to every surface, as though the light was afraid to go any farther in. Looking into that shadow, I tried to keep my voice steady as I responded. "What do you want? What do you want from us to set us free?" The darkness seemed to shift and swell slightly before deepening into a thicker patch of impossible night. "What do you think I want, silly?" Its voice had been loud and harsh coming from the corner of the room, but was soft as silk when it moved next to my ear. "A sacrifice. It has to be me." Gordon and I had been sitting together in the kitchen. It was a silly attempt at privacy, of course. The thing that had trapped us in our home was, at least so far as we could tell, everywhere. Still, being in the living room with that unnatural patch of shadow made my skin crawl, and I could tell Gordon was relieved when I suggested we move before talking. It hadn't said anything more after a sacrifice, but I think we both instinctively knew what that meant. One of us had to stay to keep it company, or serve it, or feed it. I was already trying to find the best way to broach the topic when Gordon volunteered himself. I felt my eyes widen as blood began to pound in my ears. "What? No, Gordon. There has to be another. We'll figure out something." His face hardened briefly, his eyebrows furrowing as he prepared to give some harsh rebuttal, some argument as to why he was right. But then his face crumpled, tears coming to his eyes as he looked at me pleadingly. "Gracie, I'm no good for him. Not compared to you, and I can't bear the idea of you being stuck in here." He lowered his head as his eyes sank to the table. "I won't." I knew the him meant Nick. Gordon meant to stay, but he also didn't even consider any other possibility. Just saving me and Nick. Swallowing hard, I reached out and stroked the top of his head. "I know, sweetie, I know. You're such a good man. I think we need to ask some more questions of it first, okay? See if we can figure out something else. It may be that we're jumping to conclusions, or there's some way out of it that isn't so bad." He looked doubtful when he looked up at me, but not without hope. That was enough. Taking his hand, I gave it a squeeze and led him back into the living room. The darkness was still crouched in its corner, and I could feel it watching us as we approached. There was a kind of happy hatred radiating from it that made me want to vomit, but I pushed the feeling down. I couldn't shake or stammer or falter. Not then. I had one chance to do this, if it was going to work at all. "Have you made your decision?" I could feel Gordon tensing, and I was terrified that he would speak before I could. Maybe he even tried, but once I started yelling out the words, they were all I could hear. Each syllable filled up my ears, the room, the world. "We offer our son, Nicholas, as sacrifice." The final word was still spilling from my mouth when everything changed at once. There was a roar of laughter from the darkness, and then we were outside the house, just the two of us. I gasped at the suddenly bright air, even as Gordon wrenched his hand away from mine. When I turned to look at him, I felt my heart break. I'd never expected my Gordon to look at me like that, not even in that moment. "What did you do? What the fuck did you do?" I hated you right then. Grace and I both jumped at the sound of Gordon's voice at the edge of the living room. I'd been so focused on her words I hadn't heard him come in. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in the last few hours. "I still loved you, of course. Always. But that just made how much I hated you worse." I glanced back at Grace, who had teared up several times in telling me the story. She was crying freely now as she nodded. "I know, sweetheart, I knew you might. But I couldn't lose you. As much as I loved our little boy, I loved you more." Gordon's voice was thick as he stepped into the room further. "I know, and if I was stronger, maybe we could have stayed together all the years since. If I had been willing to do what was necessary, he wiped at his eyes. But now I am. Seeing this exchange, I felt sadness for these two people that I cared for more than I wanted to admit. I felt hurt at Gordon's betrayal of both of us, and maybe even a little at Grace's sacrifice all those years ago. But the sadness and pain was small next to my anger, an anger that seemed deeper than the well within me, though I didn't fully understand why. What are you planning to do, Gordon? What is needed now, you think? Another sacrifice? My harsh tone would have normally sent Gordon into an angry fit, but this time he just gave me a sad smile. Not a sacrifice this time, Clint. A trade, he gestured to the room and then to me. One son for another. So you're going to trap me in here and escape with Grace and... What, your son Nick? What exactly do you think that looks like, Gordon? He went to interrupt, but I kept going, my words cutting across the distance between us like invisible knives. I was upset, yes, but not afraid or worried. Instead, the main emotion I felt was anger approaching some kind of righteous rage, and again it felt as though it was flowing through me more than boiling up from within. Still, I felt some satisfaction when he fell silent as I went on. Do you think this monster living here has kept Nick a little boy? And somehow kept him sane, if he's even alive, which is really hard to believe. Your best hope is that he's a completely crazy grown man. I gave a bitter laugh and tried to hold in the rest, but found that I couldn't quite manage. Actually, that's not true. Your best hope would be that he is dead, has been dead a very long time, rather than trapped in whatever hell this thing would be putting him through. Gordon's eyes were gleaming now, and his face had grown ghastly pale. I expected him to yell, but his voice was soft and trembling as he spoke, his eyes starting on me before drifting behind to her. I know all of that it's a possibility. The thing can't be trusted, but I had to try, didn't I? I had to try to get our little boy B. Cut in. No, Gordon, don't look at her. You look at me. I'm the one you're trying to sacrifice now, remember? You've already abandoned her in this place. Trapped us both in your son's tomb. He went to speak again, and I raised my hand to silence him. Before you whine again about your good intentions and how unfairly you're being treated, let me ask you this. When did you last feel our master? I pointed a finger at him like a red-hot brand. No lies now. When was it? His eyes went to Grace again, more pleadingly this time, but whatever silent response she did or didn't give, he found no harbor there. Lowering his gaze, he gave a small shrug. When I first came here, not to this house outside, but another place that it moves to and from. It isn't trapped, you see. It's like a hermit crab moving from house to house, swallowing up bits and adding it to the inside to its place before moving on. Or maybe it is in all of them at once. But it found me in a dream, told me it could give us Nick back if I would do what it asked. His face was streaked with tears when he looked back up at Grace again. And I listened to it. I think it will work. I swear to God I do. And it'll be worth it, even though I don't want to lose Clint either. When did you do this? When did you make a deal with this thing? Grace's voice was icy and hard behind me. Gordon looked down again. Nearly 5 years ago now. For a long time I didn't listen or agree to anything. Until I did. A short, sorrowful laugh at my back, and then. And you haven't felt our master since. He just shook his head silently. And the night the tape failed. The night the room flooded and we almost all drowned. Was that your doing? Gordon jerked as though he had been lashed with an unseen whip, a gasp of air escaping him as he looked between me and her. I broke the tape barrier it told me to, as proof that I would honor the deal. Raising his hands, he took a step forward. It promised we would all live. Not the client, no, but the three of us. I would not have done it otherwise. You have to believe me. I gave a snort of disgust. Real nice of you to get a promise for my safety. Had to keep your sacrificial lamb from drowning, I guess. Sighing, he gave me a nod. You're right, of course. And I truly am sorry. I do care about you. We both do, but this is our child. And we need you to stay. I stood up slowly, my eyes never leaving Gordon's. Do you now? I felt something swell inside me, pass through me just then. I heard more words spoken with my voice. Then ask for it, call to your new master and see if it keeps its bargain. He frowned uncertainly at me, but then a thought seemed to cross his mind, perhaps what happened the last time he hesitated in this place. Looking at Grace again, he called out to the darkness nestled in the corners of the room. I've honored our bargain. I give you Clint, who I love, who we both love. In exchange, give us our freedom and the safe return of our son, Nicholas. His eyes were wild as he looked around, waiting for a response. Anger flaring in my chest again, I couldn't help but laugh at him. You're a fool. You gave up the protection and miracle of something truly wondrous. For what? A fucking pitcher plant. 'Cause that's all it is, not a god. Not a genie to give you back your son or your life. It's just an emptiness with teeth and appetite that traps anything dumb enough to wander inside. Gordon was shaking his head again, clutching his hands together, as though in prayer. I beseech thee, free me and my family, he pointed at me. Take this boy who mocks you and your power. I heard Grace stand up behind me. Gordon, it isn't going to listen to you. It knows it can't stop our master when it is ready for us to leave. I didn't understand before, but I do now. She put her hand on my shoulder. You can feel it now, can't you? Glancing back at her, I nodded. Yeah, since at least Braxton. More since I met it. It's not like hearing it speak to me exactly, but it's always there, and I can feel it push me sometimes. One way or another, swallowing, I gave a weak laugh. Or when it needs me to say or do something in particular. She nodded back. I used to get that sometimes. Not as strong, but sometimes. Grace let out a shuddering breath as she looked over to Gordon. Maybe if I had understood it better back then, I could have gotten us all out without losing Nick. I don't think so. I don't think my connection was strong enough, but I'll never know for sure. Letting out a quiet sob, she wiped her eyes before returning her gaze to Gordon. It's too late now anyway. It's too late for anything. She looked back to me, her expression unreadable. Will it let us take Gordon with us? I felt my stomach twist into a ball of ice at her question. The anger was still there, but the sadness and regret were stronger in that moment. No, he has broken covenant and cast its lot with the thing that lives here. So here he will remain, not my words, but I heard my voice saying it all the same. Grace seemed to understand that too, giving my shoulder a squeeze as she nodded. And if I choose to stay here with him? The other spoke through me again. You cannot remain if you do not break covenant. And if you break covenant, you will not save him, but only condemn yourself. And the thing that lives here is very strange and cruel. Gordon stepped closer, his breath hot and panicked as he grabbed her hand and my arm. I'm still here, you know. Don't talk about me like I'm not here. I looked at him, my voice empty of the pity that I still felt in my heart. You are here, Gordon, which is nowhere, and that is where you will stay. I could tell the next words that were coming, and I tried not to say them to give the two of them more time, but it was no use. I could have just as easily stopped a storm or a flood. Release us now, in the name of the one we serve. The next moment, Grace and I were outside, and even though I didn't think I could really hear the sound, it seemed I could feel the echoes of Gordon screaming in the webs of some faraway dark. Hours later, we sat outside Grace's house. I'd never seen it before, and I don't know what I had imagined, but it wasn't this. A small ranch-style house with weeds growing in the front yard and an air of lonely disuse. I'd thought about talking to her a dozen times as we drove, but I'd always lost my nerve. At one point she'd even had me pull over so she could be sick in the grass, but other than asking if she was okay to ride again and giving her a bottle of water, I didn't say a word. I was still trying to figure out how to start when she broke the silence. I don't know if we told you this, but when we went to see our benefactor, we went in separately. I don't know why we knew to, maybe some scrap of ritual we had, or just instinct. It's been so long ago now, I really don't remember. But I recall walking up to a doorway in that warehouse, just a slip of nothing in the air that you could only see if you looked just right. And on the other side, it was a field of flowers. I turned to look at her, but she kept staring out the windshield as she continued on. But not just any flowers or field. It was the field and flowers from a day when I was 8 or 9. I had wandered off from a trip, a picnic, I don't know now, but I had found myself in this beautiful field filled with, well, at the time the word I thought of was magic. Everything felt special and meaningful and rich with layers of connection and mystery and excitement. It all felt true and wonderful, and I felt like I was part of it. She wiped at her eyes. It was the closest I'd ever felt to some idea of God, and it was the happiest I've ever been, and I'd been chasing it ever since. Until that night I stepped through the door. She looked at me expectantly, and I gave her a nod as I began. When I went through, I stepped into this enormous ballroom. Marble floors and columns, ornately carved walls so tall I could see the tops of them. Everywhere there was this golden glow in the air, and in the middle of the room was, well, it was a giant red dragon. She raised an eyebrow as I went on. I know, I hadn't ever seen a real dragon, of course, and maybe I'm an idiot, but I didn't make the connection until you told me about the field. But I think I remember now, when I was little. Like really little, I went to a used bookstore with my dad. It's probably one of the first clear memories I have as a kid. Anyway, I remember seeing this book, some fantasy paperback, on a cheap shelf down low where I could spot it. On the cover there was this giant red dragon flying. I asked my dad what it was, and he told me it was a dragon. I asked him if it was real. I felt surprise as my voice grew thick with emotion. He said it was real if I believed. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. When you saw the dragon, saw our master, did it do anything? With the field I just stayed a while, and then I understood, or understood enough, that this was a good thing. A special thing, and it would help us if we let it lead us to the nightmares. She sniffed. That it could save Gordon. She looked down at her lap. Was it like that for you? I shook my head. No, it spoke. Talk to me. It felt like we talked a long time. Her face turned back to mine with a look of surprise and even dim excitement. Really, what did it say? I frowned more at myself than her. It's hard to describe. Talking to it isn't like a normal conversation. Look, have you ever been in a pool or lake for a while, and when you finally get out, you realize way more time has passed than you realized, and your memory is kind of fucked up? Not like you have amnesia or something, but just you can't really account for all the time that had passed. It's kind of like that, a bit like floating or dreaming. I left feeling very confident, and knowing that I needed to get to you because there was some kind of danger. Since then, there's a lot I don't know or remember. Until I do, until it's needed, I guess. And sometimes it talks through me, and is that it pushing me or possessing me? The words wouldn't quite come, so after a moment of weighted silence, I moved on. And I think I understand what it is. Kind of. I felt my face break into a grin as my worry faded into the background. It's wonder, it is magic, or no. I mean, it's not those things. Not like the hyena was the real, true hyena. It's our connection to those things. I sighed in frustration as I tried to find the right words. It's not magic. It's our intuition that magic exists. It's not wonder. It's like our hunger to feel and see and touch the special things that get hidden from us. It's like the dragon, or the field, or whatever Gordon saw. It's that whisper in all of us that there's a richer, truer world beyond what we can see and touch, and that we're connected to it. She nodded. It's not a god, but the source of that which connects us and drives us to seek the truth and the magical and the divine. I gave a short laugh. That's a way more eloquent way of saying it. But yeah, it's that, and that has to be one of the most important things ever. Imagine if everything, lost that, and we're part of protecting it, of helping it get stronger by feeding it these nightmares. I gave her hand a squeeze back. What we are doing matters so much. She looked thoughtful for a moment. Did you know that it could pull us out of there? Before you said the words, I mean. I understood why she was asking and met her gaze when I shook my head. I didn't. Like I was saying, a lot of this, when it comes through me, I don't know it until I hear myself say it. If I'd known I could force its hand and get us out, Gordon would never have had a chance to come back in. Whatever it wants, or whatever Gordon might deserve, I didn't want to leave him in there like that. She gave me a sad smile as she nodded. I know that. You're a good boy. A good man Gordon was too. Her smile faded. That's part of what I don't understand. Yes, he was different after we lost Nick, but he was still a good man. Strong and smart. How did the thing reach him to corrupt him? I accepted the limits of our benefactor's power back when we lost Nick. We had no illusions that it was omnipotent or without flaws, or it wouldn't need our help in the first place. But we have done so much work since then, and obviously it is vastly stronger because of it. Strong enough to banish the hyena. Strong enough to pull us from that place as soon as you said the words, or at least make that thing fearful enough to free us. I nodded uneasily. I don't have all the answers, but maybe it just recently got strong enough. After the hyena, maybe. Grace's lips thinned down to a pale line, or it allowed it to happen. Allowed Gordon to fall prey to that thing, to endanger all of us, as part of some plan it has. She'd been looking outside as she spoke, but now eyes cut back to mine. You said that when you met it, it told you that I was in danger and you needed to get back to me, right? My stomach was starting to twist as I gave a half-heart shrug. It wasn't specific on the details of what the danger was, but it was clear enough, yeah. She nodded. And yet, there was no danger at the hospital. No danger at all except for Gordon and the thing in the house. So either our master is so limited that it blindly sensed danger and inadvertently sent us into a trap, or it knew what it was doing. And we know it knew that Gordon had fallen, or else why would he have lost favor and protection? He almost went insane in Braxton because of it. I felt resentment coiling in my middle. Why did she have to pick at this? It was all guesses anyway, educated guesses, that she was probably right about. Still, the lie of it sticky and sour on my tongue, I feigned ignorance. What are you getting at? She sighed. I just. For all our sense of doing something good and important, we really don't understand this thing that we're serving. We don't know if it has our best interests at heart. What if it could have saved Gordon and just didn't? It was strange. I'd felt my dread and worry fall away as she spoke her last. This wasn't someone who was truly worried because she doubted the value, the rightness of what we were doing. This was someone who wanted to be rewarded, protected because of the work. Wanted her family back. This was fine and reasonable, but it was a fringe benefit. The necessity and importance of the work remained, regardless of whether our master had our best interests at heart. We did not matter. If we died, others could be found to take our place. If it was lost, I couldn't even fully conceive of the hell it would trap us all in. A dark grey lie with no hope of escape, where our minds and hearts and souls twisted and withered away. I wanted to grab her, to shout these things at her, to wake her from the selfish stupor of her own grief and doubt. But no, that wasn't the way. Instead, I just looked at her a moment longer and then, keeping my voice neutral. What if it didn't? What does that change? She looked worn down and hollowed out as she searched my face. I don't know, just, doesn't that seem cruel and unfair? Doesn't it seem mean? Pulling my hand free from hers, I gave a dry laugh. I hated the harshness of that laugh, but I made myself hold her gaze. Mean? I let out a slow, tired breath. Grace, what in this life has made you expect something other than mean? It's been 5 months since that night. 7 jobs. They're not only more frequent, but farther away. Maybe because there are more nightmares pushing through, or it may be because the master is getting stronger with me out in the world. Grace and Gordon used to have to go collect the elixir. They never re-entered its domain after that first time, but the doorway was still there, and they could extract the fluid, its blood for want of a better term, from growths that would appear along the aperture's edge. They knew to do that the same way they knew to do most of what they did, some dreamlike instinct and intuition that they learned to listen to and trust. Trust was in shorter supply now. Grace says that I've changed, and I've no doubt that it's true. Some of it is the connection and influence of the thing we serve. It doesn't seem to assert control over me anymore, but I can't say for sure if that's because it respects my free will or because I have become what it needs me to be. I don't know that it matters, because the work is what matters, and it is progressing. We no longer need the elixir. Instead, Grace just pulls a vial of my blood before we begin. I'm proud to say that it seems more potent and reliable than the elixir ever was. That was an imperfect, temporary solution crudely pushed into a world where it didn't truly belong. I'm our master's representative, an anchor in this reality, a fulcrum to bring change. My thoughts are strange sometimes, part of the process of evolution as I grow past my old self, my old doubts and fears and failings. And isn't that the whole point? To seek what is real, what is special, to have purpose and find truth, to move beyond being just another dreamer. Grace clears her throat and I pull myself free from my reverie. She looks younger now, more vital, though her eyes seem flat and empty more often than I'd like. Giving her a smiling nod, I look down at the child tied to the bed. We don't need the ritual of tape any longer, but not all precautions and ritual have been abandoned. Some things must always be: the blood, the bindings, and the story. Folding my hands behind me, I watch as Grace empties the vial. The child winces at the taste, but only for a moment. Then he is drifting, and it is time for me to begin. Once upon a time, there was a dream. Now you may think your dreams are your own, that you make them from your own memories, your own imagination. But you would be mistaken. The dreams come before the dreamers. We may put our own faces and hopes and fears on the dreams we encounter, but that is simply a trick we've developed to try and hide from a simple truth. We do not make the dreams. The dreams make us. Thank you for listening till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Let me know in the comments what scares you the most. Until next time, and be careful in the dark.